by the following members. Madame Irvin Marchington, who's the acting manager within the Multilateral Affairs and Climate Change of what I understand is the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change in Canada. She'll be followed by Mr. Jared Along, who's the Senior Climate Change Specialist at the In-American Development Bank. And then we'll hear the presentation by Madame Karen Sack, the Managing Director of Ocean Unite, which is an NGO most people are aware of. Then we will have a presentation by Mr. Andrei Shlatenko on the role of blended climate finance. He is a Senior Climate Finance Specialist at the World Bank. Our rapporteur for today for this session will be Madame Jeanette Trammell, who's a Senior Legal Officer in the Department of International Law here at the OAS. Now, I was told that I had to make a brief presentation on Ecuador as my country position on climate change, so I'm going to do that in, I expect 3 minutes, and I'll do it in Spanish because that's my mother tongue. And I've shortened my statement so we can go quickly. El Ecuador, que es uno de los 14 o 17 países megadiversos del mundo, como ustedes conocen, fue el primero en reconocer en su constitución, en su Carta Magna, a la naturaleza como sujeto de derechos. Esa constitución señala que se debe promover el desarrollo a través del respeto de sus ciclos vitales, rechazando el consumo y la producción infinitas. Impulsa una diplomacia verde, así como aboga por el cumplimiento de todos los acuerdos internacionales en favor del ser humano y la naturaleza. En cuanto miembro del OTCA, el OTCA es la Organización de Tratado de Cooperación Amazónica, un grupo de 8 países ribereños de la cuenca amazónica, alienta un proceso de protección y cuidado de la Amazonía para conservar esta que es la mayor cuenca hidrográfica del mundo, libre de deforestación, como el mayor pulmón del planeta. Precisamente el año pasado, el Ecuador hizo una propuesta en el seno del Comité Ministerial del OTCA para llegar a un objetivo muy ambicioso que es lograr deforestación cero hasta el 2030. Esta propuesta está avanzando, será seguramente ratificada o reafirmada a nivel ministerial o presidencial más adelante. El compromiso del Ecuador con el ambiente se muestra también con la ratificación en septiembre de 2017 del Acuerdo de París, a pesar de ser responsable de apenas el 0.15% de las emisiones globales de gases de efecto invernadero. A su juicio, este esfuerzo, que es ciertamente global, debe estar liderado por los países industrializados y los principales emisores causantes del calentamiento global, tomando en cuenta la deuda ecológica y su responsabilidad histórica. Hace falta mantener, precautelar y dar soporte a la vida en todas sus formas, lo que forma parte integral de la política pública ecuatoriana. El 27 de septiembre de este año, en el marco del 73 periodo de sesiones de la Asamblea General de las Naciones Unidas, mi país suscribió el primer acuerdo regional vinculante para proteger los derechos de acceso a la información y a la justicia en asuntos ambientales, conocido como el Acuerdo de Escazú. Debo también señalar que en las negociaciones que se realizan en el seno de la Convención Marco de las Naciones Unidas sobre Cambio Climático, específicamente del programa de trabajo del Acuerdo de París, llamado a definir las modalidades, reglas y guía de cómo se aplicará ese acuerdo a partir del año 2020 y que debe en principio ser aprobado en la venidera COP de Cracovia, la COP24, el Ecuador aboga por los siguientes elementos fundamentales. Primero, la defensa de la convención como tal, en particular los principios de equidad, el de responsabilidades comunes pero diferenciadas y capacidades respectivas, el CBDR por sus siglas en inglés, a la luz de las circunstancias nacionales y naturalmente el derecho al desarrollo en el contexto del derecho sostenible y los esfuerzos por erradicar la pobreza. La preservación del delicado balance alcanzado en el Acuerdo de París entre adaptación y mitigación. Se ha discutido ya en el panel precisamente anterior a este tema. Las NDC, los NDC, las contribuciones nacionales determinadas, tienden a ser centradas en algunos casos solo en mitigación, pero para los países en desarrollo la adaptación quizá es más importante. Eso ustedes habrán visto que se ha reflejado inclusive en el informe de la pre-COP24 del presidente de Polonia. Pues como ustedes saben, los efectos adversos al cambio climático ya están presentes y causan más daños a nuestros países proporcionalmente hablando. Estos efectos adversos inciden de manera negativa y de manera desproporcionada a nuestros países y en particular a los más pobres y vulnerables. El año 2017 fue uno de los 3 años más cálidos registrados, con 1.1 grados centígrados por encima de los niveles prehistóricos. En este contexto, y como se decía en el segundo panel, la situación en particular de las naciones caribeñas, en el caso de las Américas, de las SIDS, son particularmente preocupantes. De ahí que mi país estima que se debe cumplir con urgencia los compromisos pre-2020. Urgimos a todas las partes que no lo hubieran hecho a que ratifiquen la enmienda de Doha lo antes posible. Asimismo, sostenemos que se debe conocer el balance de la acción climática pre-2020 por todos los países, demandando su implementación y reporte. Instamos a los países desarrollados a proveer un financiamiento adicional, adecuado, predecible y sostenible para transformar las economías de los países en desarrollo en economías resilientes y bajas en emisiones de gases de efecto invernadero, lo que supone el cumplimiento de la provisión anual de los 100.000 millones de dólares, que todavía no hemos llegado a esa cifra, desde o a partir del 2020. Es necesario, en consecuencia, contar con un balance en la adjudicación de financiamiento para adaptación y mitigación, incluyendo el objetivo propuesto de cuadruplicar los recursos para la adaptación, con recursos provenientes de fuentes públicas y subvenciones para el 2020. Mi país formula un llamado que se fortalezca el nivel de ambición climática, en especial por los países contaminantes y contaminadores y los principales emisores de gases de efecto invernadero, sobre todo a la luz y tras de la reciente publicación del informe especial del IPCC. Insistimos en que se debe fortalecer las capacidades de los países en desarrollo en el contexto de la búsqueda del desarrollo sostenible y la erradicación de la pobreza, así como impulsar la transferencia y el desarrollo de tecnología. Buscamos hacer operativa la plataforma de intercambio de conocimientos de comunidades y pueblos indígenas, que también se evocó en el panel anterior. Como ustedes conocen, el Ecuador propuso esta iniciativa y lidera este tema a nivel de grupo de los 77. Y esto con el objetivo que se reconozcan las buenas prácticas y se logre una mayor participación de esas comunidades y pueblos en las decisiones de la Convención contra el Cambio Climático, pues son estas comunidades y pueblos los que viven y cuidan las áreas naturales del planeta. Por fin, y en el marco del artículo 6 del Acuerdo de París, relativo a la cooperación voluntaria con enfoques de mercado y no mercado, el Ecuador, como ustedes bien conocen, ha introducido el concepto y la noción de emisiones netas evitadas como una de las actividades que se pueden aplicar con ambos enfoques. Y para concluir, quiero simplemente recordar que desde ayer y hasta el 9 de noviembre se celebra en Quito la 30ª reunión de las partes del Protocolo de Montreal relativo a las sustancias que agotan la capa de ozono. Y esto como una introducción y una presentación de lo que es la posición ecuatoriana sobre el tema. Y como habíamos quedado, voy a dar ahora la palabra a la señora Erin Marchington. Usted tiene la palabra.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador, and it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon with all of you to talk about this these important topics. The Ambassador raised a number of really important things in his introduction, and so I'll just speak briefly. My background is in the UNFCCC climate change negotiations, and so just to say that Canada is busy preparing, like all countries, for the COP24 negotiations, where we do hope that we are optimistic that we'll come to an agreement on the Paris rulebook and the guidelines for implementation. I also had the opportunity to represent Canada during the IPCC SR 1.5 discussion on the summary for policymakers this past October in Korea. So I definitely agree that this is a foundational report, and the summary and the entire report is now published online, so I would encourage everyone to go and have a look. But today I am speaking to you about Canada's climate finance pledge, and I'll try to focus a bit, especially in the context of this meeting, on the adaptation components of that pledge and links to the OAS countries. Next slide, please. Okay, so just to dive right in, our climate finance policies and the pledge itself is broadly aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement, so aiming to support the reduction of GHG emissions globally, and also to build adaptive capacity worldwide, because as you can hear, an important part of the Paris Agreement is the recognition of mitigation action, but also adaptation action. And then recognizing that development and climate change are intrinsically linked, our climate finance pledge is also aligned with the goals of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. And in particular, there are 5 core priorities that our climate finance policies and pledge has, and the first is to support ambitious mitigation in developing countries, and this is aligned with NDCs that the countries have pledged under the Paris Agreement. The second is to, of course, scale up support for adaptation action, and this is particularly important for, all countries, but the poorest and most vulnerable regions of the world. And Canada is aiming to do this through our climate finance pledge, but also by mainstreaming climate change into our international assistance portfolio. Third, as mentioned by Ambassador Fuller, a part of our climate finance is looking to enhance private sector mobilization of finance. And so we're working closely with the private sector and multilateral development banks and institutions to help remove barriers to private investment in climate action. And fourth, the gender equality, and you'll know again from Ambassador Fuller's comments that gender equality is a central part of our feminist international assistance policy, which was adopted in June 2017. And the driver for this is really the recognition that in developing countries, often women and girls are disproportionately affected by the impacts of climate change, but then also play the critical role in developing that response to climate change and climate change impacts. And finally, engaging with a wide variety of financial actors. This is an important component of our climate finance package, recognizing that in order to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, the shift in the global economy is going to be quite substantial. And so that's not something for governments to do alone, but with a wide range of actors. Next slide. Okay, so at the heart of our climate finance package is the pledge that was made in 2015. This, our Prime Minister announced, I think it was in November, right ahead of COP21, that Canada would be contributing $2.65 billion over 5 years, so from 2015 to 2020, to support developing countries in their climate action and in transitioning to climate resilient and sustainable economies. And so this pledge has been rolling out since 2015, and that, of course, is also aligned with the commitment that developed countries made in 2009 under the Copenhagen Accord as part of the UNFCCC negotiations, that developed countries would collectively mobilize $100 billion US by 2020 and onwards in support of developing countries and climate action. And so Canada's been moving forward to implement this pledge, and I'll get into the details of that. but to date we've announced about $1.2 billion as part of that, and that goes towards adaptation support, which I'll provide some examples of soon, but also mitigation support, again aligned with the needs of developing country partners and their NDCs and implementation. Next slide. Okay, but before I get into the adaptation examples, just a bit more on the private sector component of our climate finance. So Canada, again, recognizing that we need this large shift in our global economy, has established Canadian facilities at multilateral development banks designed to catalyze private sector investment that otherwise wouldn't happen, often due to high market barriers such as high upfront costs. So the intention of these funds is really to catalyze private sector investment in things like renewable energy, but also private sector-led climate mitigation and adaptation projects in developing countries. And the rest of the slide also lists just a few examples of some other finance stakeholders who are engaged, again, outside of the government, contributing to the climate finance efforts, especially in the context of the $100 billion goal. So Export Development Canada, who's mobilized over $550 million of climate finance since 2016, and then the new FinDev Canada institution. Next slide. Okay, so looking at adaptation in particular, and we've heard quite a few times now today how that's an important component of the Paris Agreement, not only mitigation, but adaptation action. Canada's recognized this, and part of the $2.65 billion is going towards a few initiatives. So you'll see here on the screen some examples of those. And in particular, the NAPS Global Network. So this supports developing countries in formulating and implementing their national adaptation plans. And this, of course, supports the aims of the Paris Agreement. And then Canada's made a $300 million contribution to the Green Climate Fund, which is one of the financial mechanisms under the UNFCCC, and the GCF aims to put 50% of its resources towards adaptation efforts. Next slide. Okay, so adaptation project in particular here is the Cruz Initiative, so climate risk early warning systems, and Canada's provided $10 million to this initiative, which primarily will aim to support and provide technical assistance to national meteorological services in small island and least developed countries, in particular a few countries in the Caribbean region, and also aims to support strengthened governance arrangements and communication mechanisms. So recognizing that early warning systems in all countries, but especially developing countries in light of the climate change impacts we're seeing now, can play a significant role in adapting to climate change impacts. Okay, and this is a few examples in addition to the kind of larger institutions that Canada is supporting through $2.65 billion. We also have some bilateral support in the Latin American and Caribbean region. So for example, I'll take the example on the gender responsive and community-based disaster risk management project in the Caribbean. So this is something that's aimed at enhancing the gender-sensitive practices of disaster risk management authorities. And so that's a good example of somewhere where we can see Canada's importance on gender equality and integrating that into our climate finance initiatives. Okay, and fast start. So before the Paris Agreement, there was an important decision again in 2009 under the Copenhagen Accord. There was recognition that climate finance needed to start flowing, and it needed to start flowing quickly. So developed countries pledged to provide new and additional resources in the time period of 2010 to 2012, and aim to scale that up to $30 billion US. So during this time, Canada delivered $1.2 billion, and a lot of these projects are ongoing to this day, so that's why we thought it was relevant to mention them. And in particular, there were a number of, actually 70 countries here that received support. And this fast start financing also mobilized $1.7 billion in private sector climate investments, which has had a significant impact on reducing CO2 emissions globally. So if you go to the next slides, there are some examples of adaptation support in particular that was provided to the Latin American region. So one of the examples, Canada provided $1 million to Bolivia to look at evidence-based climate change impacts on water systems, which helped inform the development of adaptation plans in the region of Lake Titicaca. And and then, there are a few examples there on the slide from Chile and Mexico. Next slide. All right, so this is our climate finance website, which we wanted to present today. Canada would like to try to increase our transparency or provide transparency on our climate finance pledge, and also make sure that data is available to anyone who would like to look up projects or regions or years. And so I would encourage you to write down this link here. And I think our presentations will be made available after the day today, but you can use this website to look up detailed country and project information related to Canada's Fast Start financing commitment, and then also our $2.65 billion commitment. So that information is being added on a regular basis, so I would encourage you over the next couple months to kind of go back and take a look. And so you can just see there an example from Haiti, and this is what the interface looks like. So just to sum up, as you heard this morning, Nick was presenting on some of the results of our G7 Leaders Summit, and I think during that summit, people, or Canada, heard loud and clear the need for more information on access to finance. How do we access finance? And so there's some important scoping work that's being done on that, and a study that will be completed. Canada's also made a significant announcement about work with the IFC on blended climate finance, which I believe is going to be discussed a bit more later today. And of course, since we've announced only $1.2 billion of our $2.65 commitment, which needs to be rolled out by 2020, I expect over the next coming months and the next year there will continue to be further announcements. Okay, so I think that's it for today, and I'm just going to leave some business cards here at the front. Unfortunately, I do have to leave at 2:30 to catch a plane, so poor planning on my part. But I'd be really happy to follow up with anyone who has questions, and for anyone going to COP24 in Poland, I'll be there, and I would welcome any kind of conversations or questions you have there as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ms. Marchington. I think your presentation was most valuable. It does confirm Canada's pledge and commitment to the Paris Accord, and your explanation is very interesting on the several instruments that are available to activate financial assistance for adaptation and mitigation activities. The next speaker is Mr. Jared Alang from the Inter-American Development Bank. He's going to deal with the climate finance initiatives in the Americas. Yeah, the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. It's a really good segue because of the importance that Canada has played in providing climate finance to us at the bank. And this has been something that we have been involved in for quite some time, even before the Paris Agreement. One of the critical initiatives that we have been involved in has been the climate investment funds, both in the Caribbean and in Latin America. And I think we learned quite a bit. And coming into Paris, we understood that there has been a significant sort of gap and a need for climate financing within the region. And so what I would want to do is just to give you a brief overview of some of the things that we have been doing, and also to sort of put a strategic, put it in a strategic framework, why we are doing this. And it's not just us, but I think all the NDBs have realized that this is a critical issue for us. Next slide, please. So we know that there's a strong demand for climate financing in Latin America and the Caribbean. This is not anything new. And one may argue about the gap, but that we do recognize that a gap exists. We do recognize that there is a critical need for climate financing. But we do also recognize that Latin America and the Caribbean, this is a very vulnerable area. And I'm glad you mentioned adaptation, because we see that there's a critical need for adaptation within the region. Next slide, please. And as a result, leading up to the Paris Agreement, all the MBBs had made pledges and in terms of targets to increase climate financing, and you can see some of the numbers there. For us, basically it was to double our lending, and that would basically move our approvals from 15% to basically about 30% by 2020, which we had our board had agreed to in 2016. But basically, as you see, that there was this collective agreement of the need to move what we were doing to a higher level. And I suspect come 2020, we'll be revising those numbers. Next slide, please. How do we get there? And for us, we realized that we needed to really focus on implementation. This has been one of the key things, looking at programming, looking at how do you have more programs on adaptation especially. And so we realized that there was a need for increasing engagements with our clients, to especially meet the needs regarding the Paris NDCs. We really wanted to know that, or to work with ministries of finance to align budgets, and that's an ongoing issue. Because previously, a lot of the discussions that were had were with the ministries of environment, and that's good. But at the end of the day, it's the ministries of finance that you really want to engage, and not at the end, but at the beginning, from the inception. That when you're having the discussions with the ministries of environment, that the ministries of finance be there from the beginning. And that's one critical, I think, lesson that we learned as we, coming out of the climate investment funds and our engagement, that to have the conversation be very broad, and also to make sure that the ministries of finance were there at the beginning. The other thing is that, and Erin had spoken about this, the need to attract concessional sources of climate financing, and also to utilize innovative instruments, because that's what, as we really are in a different mode in terms of implementation, and you need to be innovative in this regard. The other thing is to integrate climate risk assessments and measures within our operations, and that was not only did we in 2015, 2016, say that we wanted to increase or double our programming, but we wanted to have screenings with regard to climate resilience, with regard to climate risk in all our operations. As a result of that, when you look at what we have achieved, or where we have at this stage, when we look at, say, 2015, we were at about 2 billion in terms of our operations. Right now we are near 4, and so we are close to our goal. We are in 2018, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens when we do the analysis at the end of the year. But basically, this, I think, is reflective of all what has been happening with the MDBs in terms of how climate financing has changed. And again, to point out, a lot of mitigation, we need to really ramp up on the adaptation. Next slide, please. This is, if you look at it in 2016 and 2017 by sector, again, if you look at the number for mitigation, it dwarfs the number for adaptation. When we look at the mitigation, it's the typical things of renewable energy, transportation, etc. Under adaptation, we're looking at water, work on agriculture, on smart agriculture and sustainable agriculture. But there's a little section on infrastructure, because when we are looking at what's been happening within the region, whether it's Caribbean or Latin America, we need to have our infrastructure to be resilient. We need it to be sustainable. And so there's been also a focus not only on our water, not only our wastewater systems and agriculture, but really want to go after our infrastructure. Next slide, please. For this reason, we developed a sustainable infrastructure framework. And for us, it basically looks at the infrastructure from design to decommissioning. And when I say decommissioning, we are now even thinking about the whole circular economy. That decommissioning for us is no longer just simply ending up with waste from a decommissioned infrastructure project, but to see how we can incorporate or reformulate the outputs from a decommissioned infrastructure program into new programs. And basically to look at sustainability from all aspects, sustainable infrastructure from all aspects, whether it's the economic and financial sustainability, institutional, environmental, and including climate resilience, but also social sustainability. Next slide, please. In that regard, we implemented the Sustainable Infrastructure Program with the UK, but also with what we were doing with the Canadians. And it's basically to accelerate the implementation of the NDCs in LAC by catalyzing and mobilizing private sector involvement. Initially, the countries involved have been Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, and Peru. And it's to use the various instruments available to us, from equity to other risk mitigation measures. Next slide, please. Don't panic. This may look very complicated, but it's the type of innovation in terms of financing that will be required. This is the Sustainable Energy Facility that we are doing, and I see Devon here. That for the Eastern Caribbean, and it's specifically for geothermal, for advanced geothermal within the region. And it's the type of innovative financing that we will need, so that we are using funds from the Clean Technology Fund, from the GEF, our funds, and also from the Green Climate Fund, to have both grants and loans and concessional loans, to be able to bring together or have governments and the private sector work in terms of achieving the implementation of good programs on geothermal, so that the final users still have access to concessionality on the left-hand side of this diagram. And so this, this is just an example of what the type of programs or approaches that one will need as we move forward on climate financing. Next slide. We recognize, as we do that, that countries will need support. And we launched this NDC Invest platform about a year and a half ago. And basically, it's a one-shop to access resources to transform NDCs into achievable investment plans. When we looked at the NDCs, we realized that there was a need to flesh out and really put some financial plans to some of these NDCs. And our NDC investment platform basically takes or provides support to our countries at all stages of development in terms of programming, whether it is stakeholder engagement under our programmer, whether it is doing pre-feasibility programs under our pipeline accelerator, whether it's overcoming market barriers under the booster, or just, again, providing financial support under the financial mobilizer, but looking at all elements of programming as we move our NDCs into investments. Some of the activities that we have initiated on the NDC and Invest throughout the region, we have prepared financial strategies for Chile. We have done infrastructure needs in Argentina. But in the Caribbean, there's been an interesting development that we have looking at supporting the preparation of a pipeline of projects, wastewater, water, and energy, sustainable energy, pertaining to the blue and circular economy within the context of a country's NDC. The issue of the blue economy has become critical for us, and as a result, we have initiated a program both on the blue and circular economy for Caribbean island states, and utilizing our resources under the NDC Invest and under what we are calling the Sustainable Island Platform, to basically create or help our member territories pursue sustainability within the context of the blue and circular economy, and recognizing the need for climate resilience. We recognize the need that small islands, and when we talk about small islands, we're talking about island territories. It's not only simply the Jamaicas or the Trinidad's, but also island territories that belong to continental countries, whether it's Corn Islands of Nicaragua or San Blas in Panama. We want to have a program, or we have a program, that these territories, these units, can pursue sustainability within this context of the blue and circular economy. And basically what that program is focusing on is to look at the institutional governance that exists of how you would define or implement a blue and circular economy for islands. Certainly you need to look at projects, and we are now looking at a pipeline of projects for under the blue and circular economy. Obviously, to access, and once you identify and indicate what programs are there, you'd need to have resources. And so we have a facility being developed for this purpose. And at the end of the day, you need to disseminate information, because we recognize this is one of the critical things, that there are a lot of initiatives out there, there are a lot of things that are being done, but if you don't present that information, if you don't disseminate, if you don't sensitize your stakeholders, it ends up in somebody's drawers just simply as a program that limps along. In this regard, some of the things that we have done so far, we have been supporting marine exploration in Trinidad and sea level rise mapping for the Caribbean. And just recently, we just under the facility that's been developed. Actually, we already have a pillar in the facility on blue carbon, focusing on mangrove restoration within the Caribbean basin. These are some of the things that we are doing, and we are really, for us, this is a critical project in terms of sustainability for island communities within the region. And we are hoping that at some point to be able to carry it down to Ecuador, even Brazil and other places where there are island territories. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Allen, for your remarks. I think they've proven most valuable. The issue that there's a financing gap is of concern, and thus, consequently, the attraction that you're doing at the bank for reaching out to non-conventional, innovative, consensual sources. I think the idea, which is important too, is the participation from the very beginning of the Ministries of Finance in designing projects, because your interlocutor is basically the Ministry of Finance. And of course, the need to redress the balance between mitigation and adaptation activities. From what I saw, grosso modo, it's about 1/5. But in any event, thank you once again for your presentation. I give now the floor to Ms. Karen Sack. She's going to speak about the private sector engagement in climate change and resilience initiatives. You have the floor, madam.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and thank you for inviting me here today, especially to the Government of Canada, which has really been a huge proponent of engaging the ocean world in this discussion on coastal resilience. We're often forgotten off the map, even though we talk about the ocean as one ocean without the S on the end of it, as it's all joined. If we start thinking about the Caribbean, for example, we talk about big ocean states, not small island developing states, because that is the great piece of real estate that the Caribbean really encompasses. So it's lovely to be here. Just referring back to the presentation from the IDB, if you think about those bar graphs with where money was invested, there is some being invested in infrastructure in the blue economy, but very little in the ocean space, and that's one of the things we really want to bring to the table. So if we could go to the next slide, please. If the ocean were a patient, her prognosis would be quite grim. She would be short of breath from advanced lung disease from breathing in pollutants like CO2 and plastics. She would have hot flashes from ocean warming and extensive osteoporosis from acidification. Her kidneys would be compromised from sea level rise with dialysis required. And as her doctor, we would really have to start thinking very seriously about how to get this patient out of life support. But just like a healthy body is more resilient to disease, a healthy ocean is much more resilient to change. And the amazing thing about the ocean is its incredible ability to regenerate itself. And essentially what we can do to help the ocean to do that is to stop some of the activities that we enjoy doing. Overfishing is critically adding to some of the stresses on the ocean, and we are looking at undermining its carbon carrying capacity. If I could have the next slide, please. And if you can just click once more, that'd be great. Thanks. So the recent Charlevoix blue, sorry. This is supposed to be an amazing animation to wake you all up. But apparently not. So we'll just stare at the world. At least we got the continents right. The recent Charlevoix blueprint that emerged out of this year's G7 Leaders Summit commits governments to support strategies that effectively protect and manage vulnerable areas of our oceans and resources. In considering some of the strategies to address coastal resilience, we really can't forget the importance of the ocean as an Earth system. As indicated before, we have to think about it as the heart, lungs, and kidneys of the planet. Its currents carry up the primary productivity that feed the fish that feed the world. They influence the weather. They capture 90% of the heat from our carbon emissions and have sequestered about 25% of the CO2. And that carrying capacity is becoming significantly undermined. So as we focus on coastal resilience, it's really important to remember that the major hazards, the extreme weather events and sea level rise that are impacting on our coastlines are starting out in the open ocean and on the poles. So we need governments to really adopt an all-of-ocean approach when looking at addressing coastal resilience or resilience on land. We need to look at what is going on and how we can protect and build resilience at the poles and across the ocean in order to drive change. Because these areas are really our planet's insurance policy, and we can deliver the largest return on investment for all of us if we get working to meet the scientifically recommended targets that President Figueres mentioned earlier in terms of protecting at least 30% of the ocean by 2030. If I can have the next slide, please. This one doesn't move. Coastal communities are at the front line of ocean change, and these areas are particularly low-lying, heavily populated regions and small island states, which we call ocean risk hotspots. Around 10 million people are already experiencing coastal flooding each year from storm surge and cyclones. Sea level and population density projections indicate that by 2080, there will be 50 million people at risk from these hazards. Average losses from tropical cyclones alone are estimated at about $835 million per year in the Caribbean and $178 million per year in the Pacific. And these recurrent events are inflicting a growth penalty that is severely hindering long-term development. It's a climate and ocean risk-inducing poverty trap. Next slide, please. But climate risk and ocean change doesn't just threaten smaller, poorer countries. The 2018 hurricane season has once again brought into stark relief the impacts of hurricanes on some of the larger countries like US shores, the 2017 storms, which caused the loss of thousands of lives and cost billions of US dollars in damage. This past year, we've seen hurricanes Florence and Willa, which recently hit Mexico, and in the Pacific, Typhoon Mangkhut, which until a few weeks ago was the strongest storm of 2018 and collided into the Philippines, just recently superseded by Typhoon Yutu, the strongest storm anywhere in the world, which had prevailing winds of up to 180 kilometers per hour and basically mangled the Mariana Islands. These storms underscore the escalating risk from the combination of sea level rise and warming seas. Next slide. In the last 30 years, the amount of the world's GDP annually exposed to tropical cyclones has increased by more than $1.5 trillion. And in the last 10 years, insurers alone have paid out around $300 billion for coastal storm damage. And this is where working with nature and with the business, insurance, and finance sector comes in. I'd like to focus on two of the initiatives that we are working on as Ocean Unite with the business sector, which engage multiple stakeholders and recognize the critical importance of investing in nature to build resilience to change. So next slide. Thanks. The first is working with AXA XL on their Ocean Risk Initiative. There are really good reasons for the insurance sector to invest and address ocean risk, and they've been mentioned, the insurance sector has been mentioned before. The first reason is really through their commitment to closing the protection gap and making sure that more people around the world are insured. The second is their recognition that the hazards from ocean risk, from the exposure and increasing vulnerability to those hazards, is impacting on their bottom line and exposing their business model to risk. So it's in their business interests to get involved in finding ways to mitigate those risks. I think this quote, which are the only words really so far on my slides, is really incisive. It's from Lloyd's of London from earlier this year, which indicates that for every 1% increase in insurance penetration, the disaster recovery burden is reduced by up to 22%. So for their business model, that's really important. Next slide, please. So AXA XL hosted the first Ocean Risk Summit in Bermuda earlier this year. It brought together about 200 people from finance, insurance, government, academia, science, and civil society to focus on ocean risk and really try and understand the hazards, vulnerabilities, and exposures to this risk, particularly from extreme storm events, the impacts on health and national security as well, and looking at the whole picture and recognizing that we all have to actually start speaking the same language if we're going to begin to communicate with one another to address these problems. There have been a series of initiatives that have come out of the Ocean Risk Summit. One is a collaboration with Mark and his team at TNC on building blue carbon resilience credits. The other is an initiative to build an ocean risk index focused on the impacts of natural capital degradation on coastal areas and the implications that has for policymakers, both within the terms we think of policymakers in the political realm, but also insurance policymakers and how they're developing their insurance products. And the other really interesting initiative on the next slide is, and you're just going to have to click through this, and I'll try and keep up, is building an Ocean Risk and Resilience Alliance. And essentially, as we see the increase in extreme weather events and climate-related events, the insurance and finance sector is beginning to step up and recognize that their capacity and expertise is needed to help develop solutions. At the same time, we're seeing governments like the work that the Canadian government has done through the G7, encouraging multi-sector collaboration to build resilience. On the other side, we are also seeing the scientific data. The IPCC report is seminal on this. A recent paper last week in Nature showing the extent of ocean warming, showing that we actually are on a pathway towards ocean system failure and really raising the level of attention to this issue. Can carry on going. And that ocean change is really costing lives and livelihoods. So essentially looking at how a group of actors can come together, can just carry on, and work on mainstreaming into the environment, modeling, pricing, financing, and transferring risk to increase resilience, and then integrating scientific understanding of ocean change and natural capital and their role in mitigating these risks. And that's fine. The Alliance is going to focus on three specific issues. The first is driving research, analysis, and modeling, using information from these multi-sectors to understand where the gaps are and inform the solutions. Fires, trucks are so excited about this. They come to add to the mix. The second is identifying insurance and finance solutions and looking at how you can pilot those solutions. And again, the example from Mark's presentation this morning, how do you take the example from Quintana Roo in Mexico? How do you bring it to scale? How do you apply it in various sectors to drive change? And then, of course, the third element of this is bringing it into the global policy frameworks from the work that's been done on the SDGs and making sure that the ocean is part of the climate discussions. The word ocean only appears in the Paris Agreement, I think, once, potentially twice, and the one that I know of is in the preamble to the agreement. So really recognizing the critical role of the system is key. Thanks. The second initiative I'd like to talk about was raised earlier by President Figueres, and that is the initiative that was launched earlier this year as the Caribbean Climate Accelerator. And essentially, the Accelerator is an entrepreneurial engine designed to catalyze and accelerate priority initiatives towards a Caribbean climate-smart zone, delivering resilience, social development, and broad-based economic growth across the Caribbean. It was born in response to the 2017 hurricane season and essentially brings together this unprecedented coalition of finance through the banks, the IDB and the World Bank Group are key partners in it, government through CARICOM and the OECS and all of the individual governments that are there, and some of the largest corporates in the world, including the Virgin Group, as well as groups like Airbnb. Next slide, please. So it was launched in August, and I think one of the most telling reflections on the Accelerator is that Usain Bolt was announced as the ambassador for speed. And that is really the focus of the Accelerator, to really drive change at pace and make sure that over the next 5 years, the $1 billion commitment that has been made towards building a climate-smart Caribbean is realized. Next slide. So very quickly, how the intent of the Accelerator is to work. There will be 4 areas of focus as the work moves forward towards breaking barriers, advocating for change, achieving scale, and then innovating. The first is a focus on building resilient infrastructure to reduce vulnerability to a range of climate-related hazards and risks. The second is reducing greenhouse gas emissions and improving air quality. Then there is focusing on healthy land and marine ecosystems to support the region's economy and food security. And finally, enhancing energy security by promoting energy efficiency, renewable energy, and the use of low-carbon resources. And some of the really interesting initiatives coming out of the Accelerator include, for example, Airbnb opening homes to 11,000 disaster first responders so that they could go and stay there and help address some of the impacts of major storm events. There is work being done in Jamaica in Grenada on implementing the world's first climate smart city, which is being supported by the Green Climate Fund. And we are actually working with the Branson Center for Entrepreneurship to build a new cadre of Caribbean blue entrepreneurs to help build climate resilience, but also entrepreneurship across the Caribbean. So final slide, thank you. So in essence, just in closing, recognizing the importance of these multi-stakeholder engagements, I thought it was quite entertaining that as a non-profit, I was asked to speak in terms of private sector engagement in this space. But what we are certainly finding is that the partnerships with the private sector to drive change and the importance of sitting at the table with multiple stakeholders is really critical if we are going to achieve the kind of climate resilient communities that we need to for the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sack, for your presentation, or at least for the first half of your presentation, for your diagnosis on the sixth state of our world, of the need of highlighting the significance of coastal resilience and the proposals to associate the business community and the insurance committee in the world struggle against climate change. But the next speaker now is Mr. Andrew Schlatengo, who's a senior climate finance specialist at the World Bank, and he'll speak about the role of blended climate finance. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Government of Canada and Organization of American States for this opportunity to participate in the panel and talk a little bit about our experience and International Finance Corporation working on using blended finance to stimulate and accelerate climate change projects across the globe. So couple of words about my organization. International Finance Corporation is a private sector arm of the World Bank Group. It is the largest development bank focused solely on the private sector investments. We work across all the various industries, including infrastructure and natural resources, financial institutions, manufacturing, agribusiness, telecom, media, technology. And we have in our toolkit the whole set of different products to help private sector projects on the ground, starting from investments such as loans, equity, or syndication products, to providing advisory services to our clients, be it private sector companies trying to understand a particular business in one of the sectors a bit better, or governments thinking about implementing particular reform in the sector that would entice private sector participation. And finally, we have so-called IFC Asset Management Company, which is focusing on mobilizing capital and management capital for investment from third-party investors. At the moment, IFC is undergoing some sort of a evolution or stepping up to the challenge in terms of the global stimulating development across the globe. We used to be much more a project by project type of commercial bank with development mandate oriented. So we would wait and see for the project to emerge somewhere, and then we would come and help that project happen on the ground. Now IFC is trying to get a little bit ahead of the game, and instead of waiting for the private sector activities to start happening on the ground and then supporting it, we are trying to get out there much early in the game and start helping the governments to set the right conditions to attract private sector investments, and then in parallel work with private sectors to make sure they are prepared once the conditions are right so they can come in immediately. So we're trying to play a role of more of a market creator rather than just following projects on individual basis. And with that, we are scaling up our ambitions. We're promising to our board that we will essentially double the volume of our operations within the next about 10 to 12 years. We will reach about $50 billion a year, including our own commitments and mobilization by 2030. We will significantly shift the investments from mostly predominantly middle-income countries, as we do now, into much larger share of investments in IDA countries. We expect it to reach about 40% of investments going to IDA countries by 2030. And as one of these ambitious goals, we are also trying to scale up very significantly our commitments to climate sector projects. To climate investments. The goal is to reach 35% of IFC's own long-term commitments to go into climate projects, mitigation and adaptation by year 2030. So we have heard about the importance of accelerating projects on the ground related to climate change, be it mitigation or adaptation. And I think the key word and the key issue here is the scale and urgency of the problem. Things are already happening on the ground. There are projects we can see across the globe, quite a bit of projects in mitigation space. New power plants are being built. There is some activity on adaptation side. It's a bit slow, but it's getting there. But the key here is that we only have very, very few years to get up to speed and accelerate the development of projects on the ground. So, in my view, there are two key drivers that can help accelerate the speed of delivery of private sector projects. One is there's definitely a need for a very well set up regulatory system. So when the private sector companies come in, they feel relatively comfortable doing private sector, doing projects, working with the government essentially. For example, if you talk about the renewable energy projects, building a power plant somewhere and signing a 20-year contract with the government that would evacuate all the power for the power plant, that requires a lot of confidence from the private sector side. So the regulatory environment needs to be very much up to the international standards, very much to the standards that the companies are used to. But another key thing is even if there is a regulatory environment there, the government just instituted a reform. Typically, private sector is very, very shy and very, very risk averse, and nobody would want to do the first few projects. So the key issue here is to help the first several projects happen. We have seen it across the globe that the government conducts a reform and sets up the system in a way to attract players, for example, in solar PV sector, and nothing happens because there has been no track record, no project have been done in the country, and the project sponsors are hesitant. The banks would not lend to them because they don't know what's going to happen, and there's a lot of uncertainty going on at that time. To overcome that uncertainty and to overcome that perceived risk, we at IFC are using what we call blended finance tools. This is we started using this approach around 2000, started experimenting with some funds from Global Environment Facility, and over time that approach crystallized and took a very, very concrete shape, and now there is a whole trend across the globe to try to, by DFIs, to try to implement those type of blended finance projects. If you look around, the definition of blended finance is a little bit different depending on who you talk to. Some organizations tend to interpret it very broadly. We at IFC define it as using third-party money, typically public sector money, to co-invest together with IFC, oftentimes on concessional terms or in the positions taking higher risk. So the idea here is that when IFC is looking at a project which is either too costly or too risky for IFC alone to do it, or for any other for any other lender or commercial bank to provide financing to that type of project, we can bring in money from typically public sector, either from bilateral program or from multilateral program, and quote unquote subsidize the project a little bit to make it more palatable for all the stakeholders involved in the project. As I mentioned, we started experimenting with this tool around the year 2000, and by now there's a whole community of development finance institutions that gathered around the table and agreed on certain so-called enhanced blend finance principles, how we can use the public sector money to co-invest in private sector projects together with our own commercial capital to stimulate those projects, but at the same time to ensure we do it in a very disciplined approach. We don't over-subsidize the project, we don't crowd out other private sector players. So the group developed those so-called enhanced blend finance principles. They are essentially 6 principles, of which the critical ones is that there should be an economic case for concessionality. Whenever we bring the blended finance in the project, there should be an understanding that the project on its own, without the help of a blended finance, would not happen. Without the help of the blended finance, the project is not financially viable, so the private sector would not finance it. Another important part is in some way echoing the economic case for concessionality, is crowding in principal and minimum concessionality. So even if we decided to proceed with blended finance and add a tranche of blended financing to the project, we would like to make sure that the level of concessionality or amount of subsidy we deliver into the project is only as much as the project needs, not more than that, so we don't over-subsidize the project and we don't crowd out other potential players in the project. So IFC has been quite successful in working with various sources of blended finance funds. For example, we have just recently closed a program with Canada called IFC Canada Climate Change Program, where Canada provided about $260 million to IFC, which we were able to use to co-invest in various projects across the globe. So we ended up financing about 26 investment projects across the globe and 20 advisory projects to support investment activities. In the process, that mobilized more than $1 billion of private sector capital. So that's the key from the blended finance operation. That's the key perspective. You use a little bit of blended finance money as a piece in the structure, in the project structure, but that allows the project to reach financial closure and mobilize other private sector money. So the blended finance piece serves as a center of gravity for other private sector players to come in. In the period between 2010 and 2018, IFC has financed 57 projects using blended finance money at the scale of about 500 million, and that altogether leveraged or allowed to complete projects with total project cost of $6 billion. So 500 million allowed to finance $6 billion worth of projects. So that's, again, going back to my original point, the key is speed, the key is accelerating projects that would not happen otherwise by using various tools, including blended finance. So let me give you a few project examples. In 2011-2012, South Africa was facing a situation where demand was growing significantly, and at that time, South Africa was very heavily reliant on coal. So more than 90% of power generated in South Africa would come from coal power generation. South Africa wanted to move away from coal into renewables, and they started what's called Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Program. So they started auctioning licenses to build power plants. And of course, first sectors they went into were the usual sort of traditional players, including solar PV and wind. But there is a problem with solar PV plants and wind plants. They're intermittent. They don't generate power all the time. So South Africa was bold enough to also venture in an area that is called concentrated solar power, which has an ability to accumulate thermal power from the sun and dispatch the energy at the time the energy is needed. So in some way, concentrated solar power plants can follow the demand. They don't only generate power when the sun is shining, but they generate power when the power is needed by the consumers. The South African government opened up this auction, and there was quite a significant interest from private sector players, but there was also a lot of hesitation because it was a new technology. It was never done outside of, at that time, never done outside of Spain and US. And even in Spain and US, there were very few projects tried at that time. So the sponsors were interested, but the sponsors were hesitant, and they couldn't raise financing from financial institutions to finance that project. So IFC stepped in and financed the first 2 concentrated solar power plants in South Africa, providing blended finance. So, for example, one of the projects called CASO Concentrated Solar Power, it's a $1 billion project where IFC provided $26 million of blended finance, closing the financing gap, subsidizing the project a little bit, but by doing so, making sure the project actually happens. So the project was constructed, it's now generating power. It can be considered a firm power, baseload power, because it can be dispatched at the time needed. Going back to Americas, we just recently supported 2 deals, one in Jamaica, which is called BMR Wind. It was the first ever private sector wind farm in Jamaica. Again, the government really wanted to attract private sector financing in the wind sector, and they have conducted some sort of an overhaul of their regulatory system to accommodate for private sector coming in this particular type of projects. And there was an interest from private sector, but there was again a lot of hesitation and concern whether the government of Jamaica is creditworthy enough that they'll continue paying over 20 years of power purchase agreement. Whether the project cost is going to be too high because it's an island country, all the equipment has to be brought in from somewhere else. It's the first project in the country, so there's no track record. Everybody is very hesitant. IFC stepped in and provided $10 million of blend finance funds alongside with $10 million of IFC owned funds to close that deal and build that power plant. So that power plant is now operational, just started generating power very recently. It's 36 megawatt power plant in Jamaica. Very similar story in Dominican Republic, where the Picasa wind power plant is now being constructed and hopefully will become operational next year. So again, it's a powerful tool. It's not the recipe. It's not solution for all the problems. But in combination with other approaches, making sure the regulatory environment is right and providing certain advisory support to government to establish that regulatory environment and to private sector to make sure they understand the business, it can be a very, very powerful instrument that would allow us to accelerate the speed of implementation of private sector projects on the ground. At the end, I would like to again thank Canadian government for being our partner, and over the last 7 years, Canada and IFC have even further deepened our long-term strategic partnership, and we ventured essentially together with Canadian government very deeply into the space of blended finance. The Canadian government has contributed about 600 million Canadian dollars to 3 of our blended finance programs, one I already mentioned, which was closed at the end of June this year, and there are 2 new programs that are being that are starting now. One is solely focused on renewable energy projects in Africa, and another one is called Blended Climate Finance Program. I believe it was mentioned already. It will have a global focus and will work in adaptation and mitigation sectors. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Slatengo, on your remarks on the evolving nature of the mandate of IFC, on its role as a catalyst and as an instigator of development projects for private sector, and on the nature, purposes, principles, and projects of climate financing. You were the last speaker. I don't know how much time we have. I think Jennifer. If I could just ask Jennifer for a question. How much time do we have? We can accept 2 or 3 questions. Okay. So I would invite anyone open to questions if they could please make them. And if you can please identify yourself, but we already know that you are.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Lanielle Bateman from Environment and Climate Change Canada. Would be interested to any of the panelists on this conversation, but the last speaker, I think this one is for you. We are very interested in how we can mobilize private sector finance to address adaptation and resilience issues, but a lot of the examples that we hear tend to be mitigation oriented, and you may have touched on that a little bit, but any examples that you could cite of projects where that works, or where you see that there are barriers and what we might need to do to unblock those? Would be very interested to hear that, because we hear that there's investors, there's institutional investors and others, but how that model works for adaptation is can be a bit of a challenging. We tend to talk about it more on the insurance side, where we're avoiding risk, and less on the revenue stream, where in mitigation that could be more the case. Thanks.
Any other further comment or question? In that case, I'll give the floor again to Mr. Schlatengo so he can answer the question that was posed.
Thank you very much for your question. Couple points here. First of all, adaptation project, by virtue of delivering more of a public sector benefits, is much more conducive or structured for the public sector participation, and much less clear and less understood by the private sector players. Second point is, again, adaptation is a very big umbrella and includes a number of different things. And for example, we just heard from Gerard talking about wastewater projects as being part of the adaptation strategy. And I even taken notes, because we haven't at IFC, we haven't really thought about to what extent the wastewater treatment projects are adaptation projects. So we can talk about climate smart agribusiness, for example, as the adaptation strategy. But what we start realizing at IFC is that even if we go to the traditional infrastructure sector, most of the projects we do need to be looked at through the resilience lens. Even if we just build a port, it needs to be built in a way that it could sustain future changes in climate. If you build a road, we need to take into account change in rain patterns. I'll give you just a couple examples how we started implementing that approach and looking at infrastructure projects, but kind of wearing that adaptation hat as well. For example, we're looking at a series of projects in Nepal, and those are just hydropower plants, which would normally be a very traditional mitigation type of projects. But in this particular case, we started realizing, and the government of Nepal started realizing, that it's very risky to build a power plant up there in the mountains without taking into account what's going to happen to the hydrological regimes within the next several years. So this project now is being looked at by the country itself as an adaptation strategy, as a strategy for power sector of a country to adapt to climate changes. And because of that, the cost of the project goes up. First of all, you need some studies, you need data, you need information on what can happen, you need to look into scenarios. Second, even the project design itself is probably going to end up being more costly. So the question is how we can push private sector financiers finance that project as opposed to financing the regular one. Of course, one thing is you just make regulations. The country can say we can only finance projects that meet certain criteria. But in addition to that, there's still a little bit of hesitation from private sector side in venturing into something a little bit unknown. So this is again where blended finance can come in and buy down that incremental cost that making the project more resilient creates, and making sure that the project is still comfortable for all stakeholders, for participants in the project. Thank you.
Yes, please go.
I think that's such an important point, that one of the issues that we're finding as we work on this across the space is the critical role of blended finance, as well as redefining the meanings of some of these things. So if we're talking about a hotel building a resort in a coastal area, how do we use financing mechanisms where there's private financing involved, for example, to get that resort to invest in natural infrastructure as they're building there? How do we get them to invest in making sure that the way that their structures are built to resilient standards? And oftentimes that means bringing in some kind of either a blended finance mechanism or a bond mechanism where you can begin to show the costs and benefits. And I think one of the interesting pieces that AXA XL is developing, I mentioned it very briefly, is this Ocean Risk Index. And part of the reason for that is actually to begin to show investors, both private sector investors and public sector investors, what's going on the ground, to understand and model forward. So much of the modeling we do is modeling based on previous data rather than modeling on predictive data, and understanding what that's going to entail both for the private sector as it invests looking forward, but also so both the public and the private sector in terms of their investments and where they're going to be going with those, understanding the true costs and internalizing some of those externalities.
Thank you very much.
No, I think I totally agree with you, Audrey, Andre, in terms of looking at it from a perspective of resilience, that you really want to encourage the private sector to invest in these new measures. And there's some sectors that are more conducive, say the agricultural sector, that you want, say, farmers to invest in resilient seeds, in resilient new agricultural practices. And it's to, again, provide the incentives for them to adopt or inculcate into their business model these measures. And that's where blended finance comes in. And if you can look at it from that perspective, you can have the private sector coming on board. And I think that's been our experience too.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Malik. Now for the difficult part, we need to ask the assistance of Ms. Janet Tramwell, who's going to summarize and make some conclusions and recommendations from this panel. You'll have the floor, please.
Yes, thank you, Ambassador. It is indeed a challenge. We've had such a rich dialogue here. I think that we began here with Ambassador Yativa, who outlined the commitment of Ecuador to the importance of nature having its right and the importance of green diplomacy, the various commitments that he had outlined here, and most urgently, and stressed the urgency of fulfilling the commitments of the Paris Agreement that many states had made. He also mentioned in the series of examples the platform that Ecuador has provided for the exchange of indigenous peoples and the voice, so that we have the divergent voices here on various groups that are going to be impacted, and gave other examples that I won't go into at this point in time. We then heard from Ms. Marchington in terms of the various commitments of Canada under Canada's climate finance pledge, who gave us a number of the various items here, listing the 5 core priorities: supporting mitigation, scaling up support for adaptation, mobilizing the private sector, encouraging gender equality, and then the wide variety of financial actors to include. She then outlined the $2.65 billion that Canada's committed over the 5-year period, and the various initiatives that have come forward from that, and the need for the private sector and the large shift that is required in that regard. She'd also mentioned the areas of adaptation and financing that have been given in that regard, and the project example from Cruz in the Caribbean, and the bilateral support that has been given in Latin America and the Caribbean, with examples to that. And listed also the Fast Start Financing Committee and various initiatives and examples that have been coming from Bolivia, Mexico, and Chile. and then mentioned also the climate finance website that is encouraging to provide transparency that Canada wants to see increased in terms of this, in this regard. She also had mentioned that Canada has heard very loudly and clearly the need from others to for the request for access, information on access to finance and how this can be improved that was mentioned at the G7. We then heard from Mr. Aleng from IADB and the climate financing initiatives in the Americas. Here I think what was very clear that he mentioned was the critical lesson that came out was the need to engage ministries of finance as well as those from the environment, and the need for the cross-sectoral approach in this regard. How do we move to these higher levels in terms of encouraging these shifts? In terms of attracting concessional sources, we have here the balance, he mentioned as well, the need for the balance between mitigation and adaptation and the financing that can take place in this respect. He gave then the various examples of the sustainable energy facility from the Caribbean, for the Eastern Caribbean, the NDC investment platform, and the Caribbean Basin Sustainable Islands platform, and the various initiatives there that have come forth in terms of the blue circular economy. The need for disseminating information about these various things came forth too. And he gave the examples of mangrove restoration and marine exploration as well as examples that came from the Caribbean Islands Platform Initiative. We then heard the perspective, and Ms. Sack had noted how she, as a representative from the NGO at this table, was bringing a unique perspective, because this is what is encouraged here in this complex dialogue, to bring forth divergent perspectives. So I thought it was very interesting when you mentioned this idea of looking at this as a big ocean state rather than small island states. It causes us to look at these issues from a different perspective. And mentioned then again their various ideas that came from the Charlevoix blueprint, the coastal communities that have been affected there significantly. And then she had mentioned the two examples, the Ocean Risk Initiative, and then as well the Caribbean Climate Smart Accelerator. And I think that the importance there, you had stressed as well, of the multi-sector stakeholders and bringing again various voices to the table in terms of bringing this forward. I think that what that also stresses is, again, the forum that we have here at the OAS for this kind of dialogue that is so significant in being able to make those connections between the investments that Canada has been making and the Caribbean, and the need for making that shift in the mitigation and adaptation strategies. We then heard from Mr. Shintanko from the IFC, looking at, he gave a background of the IFC and involvement in this area of project financing, who mentioned as well that now, in terms of the shift, there has been the recognition for the need for well set up regulatory systems to encourage the private sector. But then also the second primary point has been the need for the blended finance approach, and how this is important in terms of being able to encourage the private sector and to motivate and mobilize the resources in that respect. And he gave the examples there of South Africa and from Jamaica and the Dominican Republic, and has also noted the importance of the Canadian programming with IFC that has been able to finance a number of different programs as well in the Caribbean. So I think what all of this comes to show is, given the need for, or given the fact that we do have these actual systems in place, we do need to bring a number of different voices together. I think then we had also the question at the very end here that was raised about how can we mobilize the private sector, not only in the area of mitigation, but also for adaptation. And we had a few responses there from both banks as well as from the NGO, in terms of how can we provide sector incentives rather to the private sector. I think that remains the question for us in the future in terms of how we can engage this, both from the perspective of the from insurance as well as being able to encourage more project financing as well in terms of going forward, both in the area of mitigation and adaptation. So that's a very rough summary in terms of some of the high points that I had picked up from these various speakers. We'll hope to be able to bring that a little bit more in concrete terms as we review these notes going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very comprehensive summary, so that leaves us for anything more to say, but perhaps I could just make two recommendations. One would be that there's been a wealth of discussions today of information, which I don't know how we can translate that into something written. There's, at least in this panel, but in the previous one too, there's several instruments out there, financial instruments, that I don't know if our key negotiators are aware of that. As Mr. Allen was saying, the Ministry of Finance acts almost as a separate partner. And perhaps it's good to, like we say in Ecuador, socialize certain information, and above all, how countries can tap into these most diverse and interesting instruments, rather, any kind of instruments to contribute to all efforts regarding both adaptation and mitigation efforts in this world crusade against climate change. But in any event, once again, I wanted to thank our four panelists, also, of course, Madame Trujillo, for a very comprehensive summary. And since I see that my colleague, the Ambassador of Argentina, is already here waiting, I'm gonna close this panel and thank you once again for your participation. Thank you.
Pero ahí
take care of that.
Estamos conectados aquí y no funciona y ella está conectada a la de atrás y tampoco. Como que ha prohibido la... Ahora sí, ahora sí, ahora sí. Gracias. Ay, me voy a buscar un café o algo que necesito que sea.
Porque ya estés ya con los espacios de estar aquí, bueno.
Así, apenas pasa.
La idea es esta, que la gente no pierda el link, que escucha.
Muy puntual que nos llamen de Accelerator o alguna de las instituciones.
Creo que mañana hicimos un programa.
Qué rico.
Me pidieron, bueno, no me pidieron. ¿Qué iba a ser raro?
Igual tendría que estarlo haciendo porque imagínate al final del mes estaría...
Al fin de año hay que hacer un reporte de todo lo que hacemos. Un resumen general. Sí, al final de año hacemos todo, digamos, tuvimos tantas reuniones, atendimos tantas, los resultados de tanto, no se atendieron. Uy, sí, pero eso es material.
Usted es la jefa.
Bueno, muy buenas tardes. Vamos a continuar con este maravilloso taller. Vamos entonces a iniciar el cuarto panel de discusión que se llama ¿Hacia dónde vamos? Enfoques de múltiples partes interesadas, exploración de un enfoque regional y próximos pasos. Estarán aquí junto a mí gente que honra este panel y en primer lugar vamos a escuchar a Cletus Springer, director, Departamento de Desarrollo Sostenible de la OEA, con el papel de las organizaciones multilaterales. En segundo lugar, vamos a escuchar entonces a la honorable senadora Alicia William Grants, presidente del Senado de Antigua y Barbuda, muy bienvenida, de Parlaméricas. El rol de los parlamentos en el apoyo a la acción por el clima. En tercer lugar, vamos a escuchar al señor Filippo Berardi, especialista senior en cambio climático, Fondo para el Medio Ambiente Mundial. El papel de las organizaciones intergubernamentales en el apoyo a la acción por el clima. Luego vamos a escuchar a Kate O'Brien, que va a hablar del apoyo a la acción por el clima y la igualdad de género. Kate es gerente senior de programa de género Oficina Global de Género, Unión Internacional para la Conservación de la Naturaleza. También las conclusiones y recomendaciones van a estar a cargo de Max Campos, jefe de la sección de la gestión integrada de los recursos hídricos, Departamento de Desarrollo Sostenible de la OEA, y quien habla, Paula María Bertol, embajadora por Argentina, va a moderar este panel. Le vamos a pedir especialmente a los panelistas que hablen claro para ayudar así a nuestros intérpretes. Vamos a 3 minutos antes de que se cumpla el tiempo avisarles para que puedan entonces redondear su presentación y después al finalizar vamos a dar lugar a las preguntas. Entonces invito al señor Springer a iniciar su presentación.
Muchas gracias, señora presidenta. Buenas tardes a todos. I've been asked to speak on the challenges of multilateralism and how these challenges might be overcome. including within the OAS. To my mind, of all the ambitions that are in the Paris Agreement, international cooperation is arguably the most critical and urgent, and it is also the one that is the most challenging. International cooperation is the overarching mechanism to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, build resilience, and to reduce vulnerability to climate change. However, from our own experience here in the OAS, we know that international cooperation is extremely complex. And we also know that the degree of complexity tends to rise with an increase in variables, such as the number of actors, competing agendas, and in the differences in the political and decision-making cultures that exist at the national, regional, and international levels. We're reminded that multilateral organizations like the OAS were created to work in good faith on issues of common interest. And here the rationale is that through cooperative action, the member states to which these intergovernmental organizations belong can achieve more by acting together than they could by acting alone. Indeed, the OAS was established 70 years ago to promote, among other things, to strengthen peace and security, to promote and consolidate democracy, prevent possible causes of difficulty, and ensure the peaceful settlement of disputes. It was also created to seek the solution of political, juridical, and economic problems that may arise, and also to promote, by cooperative action, economic, social, and cultural development. So when we reflect on the razor debt of multilateral organizations, and on the fact that climate change is such a complex, multifaceted, intergenerational, global phenomenon that cannot be addressed by any one country or group of countries, then we begin to see inclusive multilateralism as an imperative of climate action. The question, though, is how best to build such an inclusive, enduring, and impactful multilateralism on climate change. I have felt for some time that the current governance architecture of the typical multilateral organization, and I include the OAS and the UN in this appraisal, is not well configured to deal with the multifaceted, dynamic nature of climate change. And I say this because, by and large, this architecture is not sufficiently inclusive and participatory. Importantly, it does not include the private sector and civil society, two key non-state actors in the mitigation and adaptation realms of climate change. While many, if not all, multilateral organizations are engaged in climate action in some way, shape, or form, the level of interaction, cooperation, and coordination within and among them is not sufficiently deep. It is not broad enough, and it is not sustained enough. The system is still too loosely integrated. And to my mind, until these weaknesses are addressed, multilateral organizations will not achieve the impact that their member states wish of them in their fight against climate change. The COP, as we know it, to the UNFCCC, is the main multilateral forum for addressing climate change with nearly universal participation by governments, and that is mostly central governments. However, as far as I'm aware, there is no established agenda or mechanism of cooperative action between the UNFCCC Secretariat and these other international or regional groupings. Another challenge is that MEAs, multilateral environmental agreements, or soft laws, are not easily converted into hard law in national jurisdictions. In some countries, this conversion process requires the approval of national parliaments. And so when we look at the way national laws are framed, through the use of white papers, green papers, and so on, with the way MEAs are framed, then we begin to see not only the depth and breadth of the challenge of transiting from MEAs, like the UNFCCC Convention, and national law, but we also get a sense of the scope of the challenge that many state parties face in effectively implementing these MEAs. And these weaknesses exist here in the OAS, where we have mandates approved at the General Assembly by foreign ministers mainly, that are passed back to the national level for approval by cabinets and of ministers and then on to Parliament. So somewhere in the sequence of these activities, we get something of a disconnect that exists there. And this is one of the reasons I believe we face the challenges that we do now. My own light assessment, and I do admit it's light, I haven't done any deep research on this, is that very few of the MEAs that have been adopted since Rio have fared well at the national level. Nearly 3 years after they were adopted, the SDGs still mean very little to the average citizen in many developing countries. And even in developed countries, there's clear evidence of rollback as numerous policies and projects have been approved that contradict the goals and objectives of the Paris Agreement. But it's not all doom and gloom, I have to say. There's some very encouraging things that are happening that promote a more cooperative, multilateral, inclusive multilateralism that I speak about. One example is the Marrakesh Partnership for Global Climate Action. This partnership was agreed in Marrakesh in 2016. And it provides a strong foundation for how the UNFCCC process should catalyze and support climate action by parties and non-party stakeholders in the period between 2017 to 2020. Another example is the Climate Action Pacific Partnership. And I think for the Caribbean, there's some cues from this partnership that we might want to appropriate. This partnership was set up in 2017 when Pacific Island leaders launched the Climate Action Partnership, Pacific Partnership. It's a coalition of governments, communities, and business stakeholders. And that's the point I'm making. We need to bring all of these non-state actors into the frame. So the Pacific has done that. And this partnership seeks to accelerate climate action, support international efforts to achieve the most ambitious global warming goals, and net zero emission targets of the Paris Agreement. Yet another example is the Caribbean Climate Smart Accelerator, which has been mentioned earlier today. This accelerator is still in its nascent stages, but so far it does not have the elements of inclusiveness that I think we should all be aiming towards. One final example that I'd like to cite is the Climate and Clean Air Coalition. This is a coalition that was formed under the Montreal Protocol. It now includes 54 countries, 17 intergovernmental organizations, and 45 non-governmental organizations. Its aim is to support the development of hydrofluorocarbon inventories and studies, information exchange and policies and technical issues, demonstration projects, et cetera, et cetera. So now to the OES and to the hemisphere and how we can perhaps build a hemispheric partnership on climate action. I say without any fear of contradiction that the OES is truly a pioneer of climate action in the Americas, at least at the technical level. Its activities in this realm predate the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. We've been doing work in this area since the 1970s. And the evidence of that work exists in the creation of entities such as the Comité Intergubernamental Coordinador de las Países de la Cuenca del Plata in 1967, and the Comisión Binacional de Desarrollo Alta Cuenca de Río Bermejo y Rio Grande de Tarija. These two initiatives go back to the 1970s. And the OES has done work since the inception of the GEF in practically every major transboundary river basin in the Americas. We have formulated strategic action plans with the member states in these areas. Going forward, the OES member states adopted in 2016 the Inter-American Program for Sustainable Development. It is the first regional agreement to be aligned with the 2030 Agenda and the Paris Agreement. It focuses on the comparative advantage of the OES and steers the OES in areas that member states feel the OES has the capacity to work. It treats climate change as a cross-cutting issue which is something that's not done in many organizations like the OAS. Climate change is still, because the development in many countries is so siloed, it's very difficult to mainstream climate change in such a siloed environment, and that needs to change. So I end with just some ideas drawing on the Cancun adaptation framework to posit what I think is a niche for the OAS going forward. I think in line with Cancun, the OAS can help to share information, good practices, experience, and lessons learned. It's already doing that, and it can continue to do that with support from member states like Canada. The OAS can strengthen the scientific knowledge on climate, including research, systematic observation of the climate system, and early warning systems. Here again, the OAS is already doing that. Back in July, we launched in Costa Rica a PACT, which is a program on climate information that helps farmers and other key users of climate data to interpret the data in real time and to make adjustments in their planning and so on. I think the OAS can assist member states in identifying effective adaptation practices, adaptation needs, priorities, and challenges and gaps in a manner that is consistent with encouraging good practice. And finally, I think the OAS can assist in helping member states to assign attributions to climate change impacts. We discussed this morning, and I will not dwell on this any further. But in summary, the point I sought to make at the beginning and throughout is this inclusive multilateralism that we speak about needs to reach out to all of the actors. We cannot move forward with a government-centric approach to climate action because the challenge, the responsibilities do not rest on governments alone. The private sector has a critical role to play, and citizens, each of us in our own way, by our own lifestyle decisions and changes, can make a significant contribution to the goals of the Paris Agreement. Just by deciding to ride the mass transit instead of taking Uber, and well, I took Uber this morning, so taking Uber and so on, take the traffic off the roads and so on, that makes a huge difference. Cutting back on our travel, I leave this afternoon for Miami, and using more internet-based communication, that helps. Conserving water. We heard the news this morning, how many liters of water is needed to produce one apple. How can we cut back on our water consumption while at the same time not impairing the livelihoods of farmers and so on to produce these foods for our consumption? So lots of things for us to chew on, but I will end there, Madam Chair, with my thanks for your indulgence. Thanks.
Muchísimas gracias, Mr. Springer, por su además excelente uso del tiempo. A continuación vamos a escuchar a la honorable senadora Alicia William Grants, que nos va a hablar del rol de los parlamentos en el apoyo a la acción por el clima. Adelante.
Thank you very much, Madam Ambassador. Good afternoon, everyone. I would first like to thank the Environment and Climate Change Canada and Canada's permanent mission to the OAS for the invitation and the opportunity to share with you on this important and pressing topic of climate change, and also the role that parliaments and we as parliamentarians, and I say we, I notice I might possibly be the only parliamentarian in the room, but the role that we have in raising the ambition for and supporting climate action. I wish to also thank Parliamericas for giving me the support and opportunity to participate in this important meeting. First slide, please. I'm hopeful that at the end of this presentation, you all would have an appreciation of the work that Parliamericas does and the important role of parliaments in the climate agenda. Also, the climate change impact on the Caribbean, especially the OECS region, the culture of integration and resilience from my country's perspective, Antigua and Barbuda, the role and importance of applying a gender perspective for effective climate action, the important role for parliamentarians in contributing as active stakeholders on this agenda if we are going to make progress on the Paris commitments, and some recommendations for strengthening the legislative framework towards building resilience and mitigating the effects of climate change in the Caribbean. Just a few things about Parl-Americas that we think you ought to know. Parl-Americas is an interparliamentary institution composed of 35 national legislatures from North, Central, South America, and the Caribbean, and one of them being my favorite country, Antigua and Barbuda. Parl-Americas was created by the parliaments of the member states of the Organization of American States to fulfill the OAS resolution in 1998 to establish a forum to promote communication between national parliaments on hemispheric issues. Parl-Americas works in several key themes, such as the SDGs, gender equality, climate change, parliamentary openness, ethics and accountability, citizen participation, responsible political discourse, and the promotion of inclusive agendas. Now, those themes revolve around three separate parliamentary networks: gender equality, open parliament, and climate change. The work of the Climate Change Network is focused on strengthening the legislative agenda to combat climate change and its impacts and to promote actions aligned with the nationally determined contributions of the Paris Agreement. The Sendai Framework and the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, including recent work on important topics like disaster risk reduction, renewable energy, carbon markets, the integration of gender into climate action, and raising ambition for the NDCs in the Paris Agreement. It is also very important to note that Parl-Americas is an official observer organization to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and two, that Parl-Americas works closely with the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction and UNEP. There are many reasons why we think it is important to actively include parliamentarians in this agenda, and I will share with you a few of these today. This is the island chain, what we like and what we enjoy very much in the Caribbean. Now, we as a people in the Caribbean are generally very good-natured, friendly, and hospitable, and you would have experienced that from all of those who are sitting amongst you, and you've worked with some of us. The traits are second nature. They're almost primal. It's in our DNA, and those persons who have adopted the Caribbean as their home are compelled to become as friendly and hospitable as we are, even though they might not have started out that way. Now, these qualities serve us very well as citizens and residents of a country like Antigua and Barbuda, whose economic survival depends primarily on the provision of tourism and hospitality services. It is important. It is important to be good-natured. It's almost a built-in natural coping mechanism for us because our geographical location, in many ways, in and of itself, keeps our blood pressure elevated almost on a daily basis, especially when it comes to hurricane season from June 1st to October 30th. And as the next slide demonstrates, is what I call sitting ducks. Because that's exactly what we are in the Caribbean island chain. Clear, unobstructed targets. We face vulnerabilities from a range of natural disasters, including hurricanes, earthquakes, and volcanoes. The next slide demonstrates the impact of Hurricane Irma on September 6, 2017. It looks like the apocalypse, no? This is what you imagine when you think of the apocalypse, complete destruction. As we would have heard earlier today, throughout, between last night and tonight, and today, sorry, for us in the Caribbean island chain, this is our new reality. In a flash, at a moment's notice, a tropical storm can intensify to a Category 5+ hurricane, as it did with Maria in 2017. Now, Hurricane Maria, for those of you who don't know, devastated Dominica and wreaked havoc throughout the island chain last year. And given our geographical location, we have no place to relocate, unlike Canada, with all the lands that we heard about this morning. With the imposition of visa restrictions now in place, for instance, we cannot even pack up and relocate at a moment's notice, temporarily to Canada, until the storm passes. At that point, we can do no more. If we're not prepared, we fear for the worst and pray for God's mercy. Unfortunately, that is our reality. The climate has changed, and we are forced to adapt. The cost of meeting the demands of this evolution is increasingly out of sync with our capacity to earn, even though now classed as an upper middle income country in the DAC list of ODA recipients. For Antigua and Barbuda, climate change is a strain on our already limited financial resources. Climate change, however, is not just our concern. It should be the concern of each and every global citizen. And to those who have not embraced their global responsibility, as my learned friend just highlighted, we need to take responsibility to reduce or stop the use of climate-impacting emissions, change our lifestyle practices that are harmful to me, harmful to all of us and your friends in the Caribbean region and colleagues who may be sitting right next to you at this moment. And as a representative of our citizens, we parliamentarians know that this is one of the most critical challenges that is facing our countries and our citizens, and we need to take action now. Next slide, please. So what is the role of parliaments in the international climate change agenda? Firstly, parliaments develop the necessary legal and political frameworks for achieving the commitments adopted by countries in the multilateral spaces. Secondly, parliaments ratify conventions and international agreements and bring national legislation in line with these instruments. Third, parliaments provide follow-up and oversight on the execution of commitments undertaken. And it's important to note that we live in a global community, and this is a shared problem. We need to work towards a shared solution. To do this, our countries have created, or are in the process of creating, an international regime through the United Nations to collectively work to adapt and mitigate the challenge of climate change through conferences of the parties and its various related institutions and follow-up mechanisms. But these commitments that are being made in international negotiations have legislative considerations throughout. So our parliaments also need to be educated and informed in order to advance these measures in our national laws and legal frameworks. We also call upon the multilateral institutions to understand that involving parliamentarians can be an effective way to raise ambition within the negotiation position of our countries, to set the standards high and then provide oversight to our executive branches to ensure that these standards are being met. Parliaments approve the national budget, very important, and can ensure that resource allocation and budget items reflect the priorities established in international agreements adopted. Possibly one of the most critical facts to ensure we actually get to where we are going in any of our countries. Without the resources, the best intentions, all this talk won't succeed. The better informed parliamentarians are the more impactful we can have. The better informed parliamentarians are, the more impact we can have in our budgetary oversight rules. We also need to understand the emerging financial order around the climate agenda, carbon markets, loss and damage regimes, climate financing, to make sure that our countries, especially the small economies of the Caribbean, are taking full advantage of the opportunities and are also prepared for the challenges ahead. Last night I learned from the Ambassador Fuller's presentation about Canada's substantial contribution of resources for climate adaptation in the Caribbean, as well as a facility for support of our Caribbean nations in accessing these resources. And in the panel discussion previous, we learned even more. But I believe that we need to make this information better known to our parliaments and our citizens. Information dissemination is important because we have to be informed so that we can make sure that our governments are taking full advantage of these types of programs. Next slide, please. Parliamentarians can be an effective force for political continuity. And we know politics tends to be very partisan. But parliament can also be a space to cultivate and develop cross-party support for important issues like climate change, which in turn can ensure political continuity to support the sustainability of climate ambition and action. Next slide. Parliament is an institution through which the considerations of citizens and civil society organizations are integrated into the decision-making processes, and therefore, parliamentarians need to be involved in international discussions on important issues affecting the citizens of their countries. The advancements that have been made to include civil society and citizen participation in development of public policy throughout many of our government institutions and in the different multilateral institutions is critically important. This said, it should not be forgotten that parliamentarians, as the representatives of all our citizens, both those who voted for the governing party and those in opposition, are key stakeholders in making sure that the voice and experience of citizens, all our citizens, are being heard at the highest level. Now, throughout our constituency office, our parliaments, and our outreach within our communities, we learn from the people about how climate change is affecting them personally and the challenges that they face. Within our parliaments, we should continue to learn and improve how we work, to understand the importance of making sure that legislation and policies for any and all of our climate action need to address the differential way in which individuals and groups within our communities may be at greater risk to these phenomena, be it due to geographical location, disability, age, gender, or other intersecting characteristics. We must ensure that solutions are designed for our people, for all our people, and in particular, most vulnerable. Next slide, please. Now, it is very important that the gender integration is integrated, that this gender is integrated into our climate response. To illustrate this point, in Antigua and Barbuda, just after the passage of Irma and Maria, through our Department of Gender Affairs, under the leadership of our Minister, Honorable Samantha Marshall, only one of 2 elected members in the House of Representatives, we can see the results of this consideration in action. The slide that you're looking at here shows the acting director of Department of Gender Affairs, who is a millennial, by the way. I know Ambassador Mendez had called for that, the youth engagement, earlier this morning. So that's important to note. And through this department, dignity kits, over 1,000 were distributed through UN Women and to men, boys, and girls in shelter and private homes. They visited shelters and conducted assessments and made recommendations for improved well-being and security in keeping with the guideline for integrating gender-based violence prevention in humanitarian action. And they created child-friendly therapeutic spaces in the shelters with the assistance of children and student artists from Barbuda. And they also offered gender-based violence service through its one-stop location and its support and referral system. In our after-action review, we identified that even though we would have done all of that, we could have done even better for the vulnerable groups. We have identified examples such as the single elderly men who are particularly vulnerable during natural disaster because they don't often have a support network in place during the critical period after disaster before government response can reach them. There are also heads of households, both men and women, who endure stress and psychological impact of not being able to protect and provide for their families during natural disasters and even in the aftermath. And we've also noted that we need to take into consideration differential needs for support, safety and security of families, women and girls, and our LGBT community in these shelters. As parliamentarians, we can work with our citizens and with our governments to help identify the needs and close the gaps to build the resiliency of our communities. Next slide, please. There are some key recommendations for legislative strengthening. And so before concluding, I just want to speak directly to resilience building in our coastal communities, because our geography is about disaster reduction and disaster risk reduction. A strong legislative framework is needed in disaster management. Each agency in responding to disaster must be clear as to its role, function, and purpose. During a disaster is not the time to decide who is to do what. It was, as the quote says there, Aristotle, who is credited as saying, law is order and good law is good order. We feel that in Antigua and Barbuda, for instance, we have a very robust legislative framework. We have strong building codes. We have a support mechanism through our National Office of Disaster Services that works along with SEDEMA at the CARICOM level. And our Constitution itself provides for the implementation of a state of emergency and other emergency powers in place. But in light of the past year's experience and throughout our dialogue with peers throughout the Caribbean and through our work with Parliamericans, we accept that it can be revisited with a view to strengthening. And there are few key areas of legislative intervention which could prove useful. I'm wrapping up just now, Ambassador, thank you. And I just wish to highlight before I close. Firstly, we need to improve and change the emergency provisions to allow for pre-disaster evacuations, especially where a forecast for Category 5 hurricane has been predicted. We also need to address identification rules during the state of emergency and major evacuation. What we have in the CARICOM community, and particularly the OACS, is the ability to move across island states freely. But the movement of peoples when they have lost everything, including their identification documents, is a major challenge, even though it's predictable. So we need to come up with some solutions. From a regional perspective, this may include thinking about how we define people who are displaced due to climate disaster. In many ways, they are effectively refugees. The absence of international standards makes it very challenging for our countries to address this growing phenomenon. I suggest that perhaps the time is now for the legislative framework globally to embrace natural disaster displacement in the definition of refugees so that resources can be allocated to provide support for the countries that are helping in times of crisis. We also need to establish resilient transportation facilities, both port and airport, for our islands to ensure that transportation will not be disrupted or interrupted after future disaster. And funding allocation is very important. That's why I particularly enjoyed the last panel discussion. We also need to improve the disaster risk information and management systems. For example, each government agency should have its own disaster plan. And lastly, we need to strengthen our early warning systems and telecommunication mechanisms during disaster. I'm not sure how many of you know, but in the slide when I showed you Barbuda destruction, our Prime Minister had great personal risk of life and liberty, take a helicopter the day after Hurricane Irma passed through in very strong winds to see what the status was over there, because everything was destroyed. All of the telecommunication, everything, even the backups were destroyed. And so we understand now that we need to strengthen the facilities and mechanisms that we have in place. Last slide, thank you. And so what I hope that you will take away from here primarily is that we are our brother's keeper. A concept that has long been embraced by the leaders of our country, my people, Antigua and Barbuda. In the Caribbean, and with our heightened sensitivity to catastrophic natural disasters due to climate change, this is almost our daily reality. There's always someone trying to see how they can beat the system, of course, and abuse of the system is what we need to guard against, so that the legislative framework is important to spell out the rights, duties, obligations, and sanctions for breach. We have a new normal in our region, and assistance and resources, particularly financial, is required to meet the challenges we face from our geographical vulnerabilities. Parliaments and parliamentarians should be regarded as key stakeholders to both inform and advance the process on this critically important agenda. I thank you very much, Ambassador, for allowing me the extra time, and to you for listening. And I also appreciate the warmth and hospitality that I've received here in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, senadora Williams-Grant. A continuación, vamos a escuchar al señor Filippo Berardi en el papel de las organizaciones intergubernamentales en el apoyo a la acción por el clima.
Bueno, ¿me escuchan? Sí. Muchísimas gracias, señora embajadora, y muchísimas gracias también a la Canadá Medio Ambiente y a la Misión Permanente de Canadá a la OEA. I'm gonna sort of like switch to English for the presentation, and I wanted to sort of like give an overview of what the Global Environment Facility, or the GEF, as we refer to it, does with a specific focus on the Latin American and the Caribbean regions. So if you can have the first slide, please. So for those of you who are not familiar with the GEF is the sort of financial mechanism of a number of UN environmental multilateral agreements. It was sort of set up on the eve of the Rio Earth Summit to sort of channel, to gather resources and then channel resources to the developing countries to help them with the implementation and with the sort of meeting their obligation under the different agreements. It works in 4-year replenishment cycles, and we just concluded in June in Vietnam the 7th replenishment, of which we've been able to secure about 4 billion for sort of using them for the next 4 years in a number of areas, and according to a strategy that I'm going to quickly highlight to you. And next slides, please. So first of all, I wanted to thank Canada for the invitation, and this slide is really meant to give back to Canada a bit of credit for what they've been doing for the international climate change finance community, and in particular to the GEF. Canada has been the 7th biggest contributor during the last replenishment, of contributing over the lifetime of the fund about $1 billion in terms of cumulative pledges and cash disbursements, and it also supports 2 smaller funds that are focusing on adaptation. The least developed country fund, of which only Haiti is relevant for this group, and the Special Climate Change Fund. More recently, they've also contributed $5 million in an initiative that has been requested by a number of developed countries, including Canada, to enhance the level of transparency for reporting under the Paris Agreement. Next slide, please. And in terms of the GEF footprint in LAC, over the last 25 years, LAC has received about a quarter of all the resources under annual replenishment, which is somewhere around in the region of $3.5 billion US dollars. And for the GEF 7 replenishment, which is the next cycle, we also expect that we would sort of keep in line with that level of funding. A quarter of the resources that are sort of in the GEF 7 replenishment cycle will be targeting the LAC region. In terms of governance, we pretty much organized around the council that has 16 members from developing countries and 16 members from developed countries, and the GEF Secretariat, which I'm part of, that sits here in Washington, D.C. And as I said earlier, we serve as a financial mechanism for a number of UN conventions, including the Convention for Biodiversity, the one to combat desertification, and of course the Convention on climate change. We work through 18 accredited agencies, which include most of the UN agencies, include UNDP, UNEP, UNIDO, but also the sort of larger development finance institutions such as multilateral development banks and a number of large international environmental NGOs. We have a number of different ways that countries can structure projects with support from the GEF Trust Fund. We generally have full-size projects, are those above 2 million, and then below 2 million in a somewhat simplified approval procedure. We have the mid-size project. We also approve programs. So we have a programmatic approach to sort of streamline approval of individual child projects under a specific umbrella when we sort of like aim to achieve larger scale impact in a specific sector. And then, of course, we also support countries in their enabling activities, such as all of the reporting activities under the different UN conventions. And for just 7, the way the fund is organized and the way different countries can access resources is around 5 different focal areas, of which climate change, of course, is a very, very prominent one. Climate change allocation is accompanied by an allocation for biodiversity, land degradation, international waters, and chemical and waste. And then we are introducing, to sort of like try and move past the idea of different silos, we are introducing also cross-cutting impact programs that really have the ambition and the idea that you can achieve multiple global environmental benefits by sort of touching on different focal areas with the same project. So an example of that could be projects in sustainable land management. They would generally tend to have results both in terms of potential mitigation of emission reduction or avoidance of emissions from deforestation, as well as benefits that relate to biodiversity, for example. So we are very much in GEF 7 trying to push for integrated approaches, and the impact programs, I'm going to talk about each one of them briefly later, is basically our effort to go in that direction. So I'm going to quickly touch upon each of the focal areas, and the idea here is, again, try to look at how they are relevant for the Latin American Caribbean region. We've done some research looking at what are the areas where the scarce resources that the GEF has vis-a-vis the huge funding gap that exists out there can be used in the most possible and most effective fashion. One of the challenges that we see in the cities across the region is in transportation. This is an area where reducing emission is going to be challenging, and so we really are try to increase and ramp up our support to this area, including through a specific push to support country to adopt framework for electric mobility, and sort of both on the regulatory side and on the side of working with the private sector to make sure that the value chain is in place in each participating countries for the different actors to be incentivized to participate in the market, not just the auto manufacturer, but also the manufacturers of the charging station, the batteries, etc. And much of our sort of help when it comes to mitigation will be done in a city context, and this is sort of recognizing one of the prominent trends in our region, which is, and I say our region because I work at the IDB so many years, but in the LAC region is basically sort of rapid urbanization, and so we recognizing that we want to focus more and more on urban centers. In terms of adaptation, as I said at the beginning, we have a couple of funds, the least developed country fund and the special climate change fund that have adaptation as the core of their mission. As you see, there are some numbers there of the number of projects that were done over the years and some number of countries that have been beneficiaries of those projects. We want to increase the level of innovation in the projects that we support, and this is because we really have not the resources that are available are scarce, and programming is somewhat dependent on the sort of the moment when these resources are made available by donors countries. So we think that an increased focus on innovation is very important, and picking up, for example, on a question from a colleague from Canada Environment earlier on in terms of what strategies and funds can be thought of or structured or designed to encourage private sector participation. We've done that in a couple of instances. I can talk about that later if it's still of interest. Next slide, please. In the biodiversity area, biodiversity is an area that has encountered a lot of interest, and is an area that expanded in the last replenishment cycle. In Vietnam, donors and recipient countries keep asking for biodiversity resources, where again, the problem is try to create the space for the private sector to prove the viability of revenue-based sort of projects. And our focus here is going to be in terms of strengthening and keep supporting countries in strengthening protected areas and mainstreaming biodiversity in the economic sectors such as agriculture, forestry, and fisheries, while helping also countries to assess their natural capital and establish incentive schemes to protect it. In the area of land degradation, one of the initiatives that was spearheaded under the Convention to Combat Desertification was the Land Degradation Neutrality Initiative, which basically is an effort to counterbalance expected loss of productive land with the recovery of areas that are degraded. So the idea here is it's okay to develop new areas for productive uses, but we need to make sure that it's a zero-sum game, though. So as we lose one hectare from pristine environment, then we sort of recover that same hectare somewhere else. And of course, again, the focus on enabling environment policy and regulatory framework remains very important. International waters, here we continue to sort of facilitate our work to bring together different actors in different countries that have common spaces and share common resources, such as the Amazon River Basin, as well as transboundary large marine ecosystems, such as the Caribbean one. And finally, to close on the focal areas in the chemical, 3 minutes, yeah, and the chemical and waste. This is an important area for our region, especially in terms of artisanal and small-scale mining. The Jeff has supported projects there to try and sort of mainstream mercury-free systems and equipment in a number of countries. These are the three cross-cutting impact programs. I'm going to go fast through them. So the first one is the Sustainable Forest Management Impact Program. It focuses on globally important forests and ecosystems. For the LAC region, they're particularly important are the Amazon one for obvious reasons, but also the drylands because of for example, the area like the Gran Chaco, which is shared by Argentina, Bolivia, Paraguay, is an area that is so big that the global environmental benefits that we can reap from structuring projects and programs in these ecosystems are really quite significant. So we want to be there. And the same can be said for everything related to food production and value chain around food production. Think about commodities like soy and grains that are very sort of important for the economy of the LAC region. So as we increase the pressure from markets to source more and more of these commodities, there has to be a response on how to make sure that these value chains are deforestation free, for example. So our idea is to work with anchor companies there to support them as well as countries to establish the right incentives. And then finally, as I said at the beginning, the Sustainable City program is something that we think from the mitigation standpoint is going to be particularly important, but also to a certain extent on the adaptation side. I mean, we've seen the sort of disasters that a number of cities, for example, in Colombia, Cali, Bogota, are constantly a victim of floodings. And so like a better urban planning, better integrated urban planning can bring benefits in terms of both reducing emission, decongesting city center, helping people going back to the city centers that in many Latin American countries tend to be abandoned for the suburban areas. And so as a last slide, looking ahead and sort of summarizing where we see there's the most need for climate finance in Latin America. Well, first of all, we know that the available funding is not going to be able to fill the finance gap, the needs, and so we want to focus on where we think the scarce funding can be most effective, and in particular these we think is going to be electrification of transport and really working at city level with the city governments and the private sector. On the biodiversity conservation, LAC has been a pioneer, pioneering systems like payment for environmental services and innovative funding strategies. So we want to very much continue to work on the biodiversity areas, recognizing the co-benefits that that can bring in terms of both adaptation and mitigation. And then finally, in the area of chemicals and waste, programming on these area is going to be very important for us, both for the rapid development of the region, as well as for the high use of industrial and agricultural chemicals, and finally, because of the high presence of environmental degradation drivers such as mining.
Tante gracias, Felipe. Bueno, ahora vamos a escuchar entonces a Kate O'Brien, apoyo a la acción por el clima y la igualdad de género.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. I think I'm the last panel of the day and a very rich agenda, so I hope you'll stick with me for 10 or 15 minutes or so. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Canada. Thank you to OAS for the invitation. IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, is an intergovernmental organization made up of state and non-state members, including many of you, I presume, coming from ministries and agencies of environment and international organizations. You are our members, you are our partners, and thus we know that across the region, we are leaders on gender and climate change action. At IUCN, gender-responsive approaches to climate change, next slide please, have been a priority of ours for now over a decade, and we've been working with many of you across the region to develop gender-responsive approaches to enhance mitigation, adaptation, and resilience building. So today I've been asked to talk a little bit about the gender and climate change connections more in depth, and then specifically share some experiences from our own methodologies, our multi-stakeholder cross-sectoral participatory methodologies to respond and adapt and mitigate to climate change in a more gender-responsive fashion. Next slide, please. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in its 5th assessment report, concluded with very high confidence that climate change will exacerbate existing inequalities, including, and not limited to, those based on gender. Just last week, in the new 1.5 degree report, Chapter 5 went even further to say that identifying and addressing poverty and inequality is at the core of staying within a safe and just space for humanity. So, next slide, please. We have to pause and ask, what does that look like? What does resilience look like? Who is resilience? In the aftermath of a hurricane or a mudslide, an earthquake, what does resilience look like? In the face of a transition to renewable energy or a greener workforce, what does resilience look like? In the face of changing agricultural yields, outputs each year, not to mention extension services and inputs that go into agriculture, what does resilience look like? Next slide, please. According to our own research done in the region of the Yucatan Peninsula, what does resilience look like when only 6% of land rights are held by women, that women are not able to realize their full rights? Next slide, please. And in fact, while the importance of gender and gender equality is embedded in our international frameworks, actually in all of the major environmental agreements, there are mandates to gender, and the 3 Rio Conventions now have strong gender action plans. While we have embedded both climate resilience and action, sustainable development, and women's empowerment and gender equality in our national frameworks, we still have a long way to go. According to our own research, again, in 6 out of 9 major environmental decision-making processes, women remain dramatically underrepresented. And the image that you have on the slide is from our Environment and Gender Information data set, which shows that women hold only 12% of major national environmental decision-making positions. And this is a lost opportunity for a number of reasons, and not least among them, that research shows that diversity in environmental decision-making, diversity in decision-making yields better results. More specifically, that diversity in climate change decision-making will be able to anticipate risk better and prepare for the unknown. And arguably, that is what climate change is in our communities. Next slide, please. So the data is clear. Gender-based gaps, discrimination, biases are among the most pervasive in all of our communities in the world. Women make up an average of 43% of agricultural labor in developing countries, but have access to 5% of extension services. 90% of our countries have at least one, and typically it's far more than one, law restricting economic equality for women. While women, we know, bear the primary responsibility for collecting energy resources and managing natural resources day in and day out, they hold 4% of World Energy Council chairs. And these are quite dire statistics when we think about the impacts of climate change, that without action on climate change, 100 million people are said to be forced into poverty by 2030. Climate change is rolling back our sustainable development efforts, and it's rolling back our efforts to empower women and advance gender equality. Because of social, economic, and political inequality, women and men experience climate change differently. They have different needs and different capacities to cope, lead, and act. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the evidence is also clear that gender equality is an opportunity, that gender equality is transformative across sectors. And there's data across sectors that gender equality, including women, women's empowerment, increasing women's ability to realize their full rights, delivers on food security, water security. It improves business bottom lines. It increases the efficacy of projects at all levels. But I want to tell a quick story of what this actually looks like. It's a story from another region. But IUCN invests in facilitating processes on forest landscape restoration that we heard about from the Jeff around the world. Restoring our forest ecosystems underpins the natural resources that are the very basis for life and livelihoods in all of our countries. In Malawi, the government and stakeholders, together with IUCN, brought together workshops to identify with the women and men in the communities what areas of the forest to restore and what trees to plant. The men were brought together and they identified 47 types of trees. The women were brought together and they identified 47 types of trees, and they were completely different lists. The men's list was on trees that were primarily for timber and charcoal. The women's lists were for medicinal products, fruit, and nuts. Both are important. By the way, the women's don't involve cutting down the trees, the renewable resources. Both lists are important, but the point is that unless we take into account both lists, we won't have a full solution. Next slide, please. So now I switch to a little bit about how we work at IUCN, the kinds of methodologies that we do, and how we hope that we are contributing. Next slide, please. So we in the Global Gender Office, we are a global technical support office, which means that we work with our own IUCN colleagues across the union, our programs and country project offices around the world. And we also work with our partners and our members, our state and non-state members. And our approach is multi-pronged, as you can see here. It starts at the top with data and knowledge generation, because there are still profound data and knowledge gaps at the intersection of gender and environment. Among our initiatives initiatives we launched, as I mentioned before, the EGI, the Environment and Gender Information Platform, which is a unique data creation platform looking specifically at those variables, the gender and environment nexus. We do a lot of capacity building and training, policy guidance across the major environmental, multilateral environmental agreements. At this time of the afternoon, I really need another cup of coffee, excuse me. We provide technical assistance at all different levels in country and at an international, subnational level. And then really importantly, we feed it back into the cycle where we're valuing women's and men's contribution and knowledge, and we're realizing the impact. Next slide, please. So part of our strategies for working involve participatory, cross-sectoral, multi-stakeholder approaches to bridge the gaps, and importantly, to help countries implement their commitments on both sides, on the climate side and sustainable development, and on the women's empowerment and gender equality side. Our Climate Change Gender Action Plan methodology, the CCGAP methodology, has been employed nearly 24 times in recent years around the world, including, I believe it's 7 times across the Americas. It's a multi-pronged approach that brings together stakeholders and decision makers, again, across the environmental sector. So we're bringing together for the first time decision makers from forestry programs, environmental commissions, parliamentarians, absolutely, women's organizations, gender ministries, which tend to be forgotten, and the gender focal points across the environmental ministries as well. The first step in the process is to collect the data, to analyze the climate change issues across the government's priority sectors. So again, that's health, water, forest, agriculture, transport, urban planning. The Dominican Republic will launch its CCGAP later this year, and it is the first country to include aviation and gender as a priority sector. We map the stakeholders. And again, the important part of that is actually including the women. Sometimes we joke around and say, oh, well, how is climate change, how can we develop climate change activities that work for women? Ask the women. That's a wonderful place to start. The next part of the process is leveling the playing field. This involves training women in women's organizations, as well as, again, the gender ministries and the gender focal points on climate change issues. Because even though women are every day adapting to climate change, they might not know what the UNFCCC is. So leveling the playing field in terms of knowledge is incredibly important. And likewise then, bringing the women to the multi-stakeholder dialogue tables with their negotiators, with their decision makers, with their parliamentarians, so they can advocate for themselves what their priorities are. This sounds like a crazy process, but it works every time. When you get these multi-stakeholder groups together in the same room, beautiful things happen, and they come up with incredible ideas for innovative activities, which I'm going to get to in a second. And the last step is simply to act. And it goes back to so many of the points that have been made throughout the panels today, that these action plans are nothing if they are not implemented and they're not resourced, including the fact that all major environmental multilateral agreements have gender mandates, so do the finance mechanisms. These processes give an opportunity for multiplied benefits. Thank you so much. Next slide. So, like I said, CCGAPs have unfolded in 23 countries around the world. Sonora, Mexico, earlier this year, produced a subnational climate change gender action plan, the first in a protected area and one that's governed by indigenous peoples. Next slide, please. This image here is just a quick visualization of Peru's CCGAP process. It brought together more than 20 women's organizations, including women's indigenous organizations from across the regions of the country, and it trained more than 100 women and men from across different ministries and sectors on gender and climate change connections. All of it was around Peru's 8 priority sectors for climate action, mitigation, adaptation, and resilience building in the country. And 18 activities, priority activities, are being implemented now across sectors. And I want to note here, it's not represented on the slide per se, but I want to note here that these processes also change the way donors work. The US funded this process, and the US mission changed the way it worked on climate change because it had been a part of the multi-stakeholder approach here. Next slide, please. Thank you. I won't go through all of the varied and plentiful examples of the kind of impact that a process like this can have. I'm going to give you instead just another quick story. It's one of my favorite examples, and it comes from a different region, from Egypt. In Cairo, transportation is a huge problem for anyone who has ever been there. Pollution is a huge problem. Transportation is also a gender issue because women do not tend to use public transportation. It's also thus a gender and climate change issue because they get harassed, because the rates of gender-based violence on public transport are high. So in the CCGAP process, the women came up with a pretty brilliant solution, if I can say so myself. Climate change mitigation, sustainable development, women's economic empowerment, women's safety and security, and women's rights and resilience. That's through a women-led water taxi network on the Nile. Next slide, please. So what comes next? Next slide. Tremendous opportunity, we think. More than 40% of countries' nationally determined contribution, NDCs, include gender in some capacity. We feel very strongly that the experiences from and the leadership, including of many of your governments, and the specific activities from these CCGAP processes can and really must inform the revision, the development, the implementation processes for NDCs around the world, ensuring that decision-making, planning, budgeting, and action, and I'll reinforce the budgeting bit, reflects the needs and priorities of all people, being key to adaptation, mitigation, and resilience. Next slide, please. In terms of a unique leadership role for this region, which has already demonstrated leadership in gender and climate change in so many ways, would be empowering women as agents of change across mitigation sectors. The Dominican Republic and its CCGAP may lead the way there. The image at the top here, this is an analysis that we did of country action documents submitted to the Sustainable Energy for All initiative. You can see an incredible number here. 84% of them include gender considerations in some way. Click next, please. Only 2% of them include women as agents of change in the context of gender and energy. The only one comes from this region. I don't know if someone is here, but kudos to Guatemala. Next slide, please. Just very briefly, this is my last slide, additional opportunities that we see and priorities for us in our office. We are developing now and will launch early next year a brand new research paper connecting the dots on gender-based violence and environmental issues. This is a very under-researched area and data is scarce. The only data set we know for sure is that none of the major environmental policies or agreements include GBV. And yet, in the face of climate change with escalating risks, GBV is on the rise, which undermines security and safety at all levels. Secondly, like I've mentioned many times before, we are a bit obsessed about data creation and analysis at the nexus of gender and environment. Through our EGI and other efforts, we are working to put out recommendations for gender indicators, including to measure not only the NDCs, but the SDGs. The SDGs are an interlinked framework for action, but the indicators are not. And there are still tremendous gaps at the gender-environment nexus that the SDGs are threatening to exacerbate. Next slide, I believe that is my thank you slide. Thank you so much for the invitation and for your attention.
Muchas gracias, Kate. Y ahora sí, vamos a pasar a las conclusiones y al resumen, que seguramente habrá hecho un gran esfuerzo Max Campos para poder lograrlo. Vamos a darle entonces a él la palabra.
Bueno, muchas gracias, embajadora, y las voy a hacer en español para mantener la audiencia bien atenta y poniendo mucho esfuerzo en lo que vamos a comentar. Efectivamente, es muchísimo, es muy difícil. Estas presentaciones han sido tan ricas y realmente uno aprende muchísimo. Esta última es impactante, y nosotros que estamos en el área del Project Management aquí en la OEA, realmente nos pone de frente con estadísticas claras, y cuando estamos hablando con cooperantes como Canadá, en este caso, con sus planes de manejo, me parece que toda esta información realmente sensibiliza muchísimo el trabajo que se debe hacer. Pero bueno, déjenme comenzar por destacar algunos elementos y algunas ideas mencionadas por el director Springer alrededor del tema de la multilateralidad y los esfuerzos de las aproximaciones regionales. Hay un rol muy claro que bien el director Springer explica, que la multilateralidad muchas veces ha estado para fines muy específicos, por ejemplo, en cuanto a lo que es la promoción de la reducción de gases de efecto invernadero, y una serie de acuerdos que han girado alrededor de estos temas, la adaptación misma, ¿no? Pero sin embargo, este tema, cuando se traduce en cooperación, en cumplimiento de acuerdos, empieza a tocar algunas complejidades obvias de muchas cosas muy particulares de los países, el tema de soberanía, el tema cómo se toma, cómo se lleva, cómo se traslada al marco político nacional, que bien nuestra colaboradora, la senadora, lo ha mencionado en su parte. Me parece que es importante. Pero si bien es cierto, también destaca el director Springer que a través del esfuerzo que, por ejemplo, el ejemplo más claro de la multilateralidad que tenemos, que somos nosotros aquí en el caso de la OEA, pues hemos hecho muchas cosas, y hemos puesto durante muchos años un gran interés en cómo conectarnos cada vez más con los países para poder realmente hacer algo que Clitus menciona muy bien, y es que juntos podemos más y abarcamos más y somos más sólidos muchas veces que haciéndolo solos. Y cuando muchas veces somos países pequeños, que no tenemos todas las capacidades para poder saltar a la gran implementación, pues ciertamente la unión y los clústeres de países, o la cooperación triangular entre países en un marco como la OEA, podría ser muy interesante, y ha dado algunos resultados en muchos casos. Mencionó el caso del esfuerzo que se está haciendo con este programa de monitoreo del clima en el Triángulo Norte, que es la zona azotada por el corredor seco y por las sequías frecuentes, que en muchos casos se ha hecho relaciones hasta con las migraciones, y es un esfuerzo que viene de organismos de investigación en Costa Rica, en compañía con los organismos de investigación y trabajo de Honduras, Guatemala y El Salvador, en un territorio trinacional que le llaman ecológicamente indivisible, que se llama el trifinio. Entonces aquí hay toda una articulación interesante de triangulación de cooperación en lo que la multilateralidad puede dar. También hay algunas cosas que se refiere el director Springer, sobre todo en los temas de las convenciones, y luego cómo saltar a la implementación en lo nacional. Creo que lo acabo de decir, pero también lo pongo muy de manifiesto porque también se ha mencionado en el caso de los parlamentarios. Hay un tema que lo he escuchado 3 o 4 veces en esta conferencia, y es el tema de las atribuciones al cambio climático, y yo que vengo de esa esfera y esa área de estudio, me siento sumamente feliz de escuchar que ya el tema de las atribuciones sea algo que esté penetrando tanto, ¿no? Y yo creo que cuando hablamos de cooperación, pero hablamos de la cooperación hacia los temas que realmente son atribuibles al cambio climático, me parece que estamos creando una estratificación, una diferenciación muy particular para que sean lo que le llaman en inglés los key risks and key vulnerabilities, que son las cosas más serias que se deben abordar como prioridades en la forma de enfrentar este cambio climático. Luego tuvimos una muy interesante presentación, de las cuales rescato algunas cosas fundamentales. Es el papel que tienen los parlamentarios en toda esta cooperación del cambio climático, en las acciones, en el cumplimiento. Me escuché con gran simpatía el hecho de que tienen sus propias redes especializadas para enfrentar ciertos desafíos específicos, el cambio climático uno de ellos, y me parece que es una de las formas más valiosas de cómo retroalimentarse de múltiples actores hacia la consecución de un objetivo. Y me parece que eso es algo que debemos tomar nota para aprender en otras áreas. También destacó la senadora Williams con mucho cuidado, pero yo quisiera destacar el hecho de que las finanzas de los países ya están casi agotadas para enfrentar un desafío más. Recuerden que los primeros 10 años del año 2000 tuvimos 10 desafíos en simultáneo afectando el planeta. La energía, la parte económica, recuerdan las famosas burbujas económicas financieras en el mundo, la salud, el clima, el agua. Eran 10 en ese momento, ¿no? Entonces realmente este es un mundo agotado donde los países ya, sus sectores financieros difícilmente pueden responder a esto y ya no podemos hacer ni más leyes ni pedirle más a la gente ni a las empresas porque al final de cuentas los desafíos son muchos. Entonces me parece que esa mención que usted hace, senadora, es sumamente importante, sobre todo cuando sabemos que el cambio climático que exacerba los eventos extremos, pues van a ser implacables también en el futuro, ¿no? Y entonces es ahí donde surgen alternativas y una es cómo alcanzamos esa sostenibilidad y usted también lo plantea y es que a través de los parlamentos se garantiza la continuidad política, pero no la continuidad política de las personas, sino la continuidad política del pensamiento y las acciones, donde hay cosas de las cuales se deben plantear que deben convertirse más en políticas de Estado y menos en políticas de gobierno, lo que tiene que ver con la naturaleza, con la gestión del riesgo de los desastres, la forma de adaptarnos, el sector de energías sostenibles. Tienen que ser políticas que van más allá de los 50 años inclusive, donde no importa el gobierno que esté, todos seguimos apuntando hacia el mismo objetivo. Y son los parlamentos y desde ahí donde todo esto empieza a suceder. Y para esto tenemos mecanismos que nos ayudan a articular algunas de estas cosas. Tenemos al fondo, al GEF, al Fondo Global del Ambiente, que básicamente el GEF no es un banco, ni es un donante, el GEF es un facilitador de procesos, pongámoslo así. Se origina mucho con el Banco Mundial, los bancos participativos, pero al final es un facilitador de cosas que los países solicitamos, pero que somos socios también en la implementación, porque el GEF no es que le da a uno un fondo únicamente para hacer esto, sino que el país tiene que aportar su material humano y su in-kind contribution 4, 5 y 6 veces. O sea que somos socios en la solución. Entonces cuando hablamos de, por ejemplo, en la OEA, proyectando hasta el 2025, desde hace más o menos 30 años que venimos, 30, 40 años trabajando, y los últimos 20 con el GEF, hemos movilizado $1 billón, solo en el tema del agua. $1 billón es un montón de plata, dicen ustedes, bueno, pero ¿cómo? Bueno, sí lo hemos hecho. ¿Por qué? Porque los países han puesto 4 y 5 veces a sus científicos, a sus centros de investigación, su información, sus datos. Y todo eso tiene un gran valor en el mercado del conocimiento, la información y la toma de decisiones. Y eso me parece que es esa facilitación que hace el GEF magnífica y que continuamos, pues obviamente, trabajando muy de cerca. Más en el plano, y ustedes vieron que la OEA no aparece como agencias de implementación, sino que aparece como ejecutor, porque siempre hemos escogido estar cerca de los países porque la OEA, al final de cuentas, está al servicio de los países. Bueno, esto con respecto al GEF y qué mejor cierre que hemos tenido que poner esas estadísticas que realmente no es que no nos van a dejar dormir hoy, pero ciertamente nos van a dejar meditando mucho alrededor de estos temas en los cuales ciertamente, bien lo dijo Kate, there is still a long way to go, y es cierto, realmente esos contrastes que hemos visto acá son impactantes y tenemos que entrarle al tema, pues obviamente a través de estrategias como Gender Responsive Actions, Climate Change Gender Action Plans, creo que es fundamental. Yo nada más cierro diciendo este asunto, porque la pregunta que la embajadora deja planteada al inicio para todos nosotros es hacia dónde vamos. Y creo que las conferencias de esta mesa ponen en evidencia las 3 cosas que tenemos que abordar en ese hacia dónde vamos. Primero, tenemos que evaluar si tenemos las capacidades de información, las capacidades de conocimiento y las capacidades para podernos mover hacia esa ciencia que va a fortalecer la toma de decisiones, porque en estas primeras mesas que están quienes toman las decisiones en esta organización no van a asumir ninguna a modo de y grandes incertidumbres, sino que es esa ciencia, información y conocimiento lo que va a hacer que la embajadora realmente tome una decisión robusta y sólida en favor de ¿qué? De que vengan las inversiones que tengan retorno y que al mismo tiempo retroalimenten la innovación, y entramos en el círculo de la sostenibilidad. Entonces yo creo que lo que se ha dicho en esta mesa circula alrededor de esta forma de pensar, y creo que ante las interesantes opciones que Canadá presenta y comparte con nosotros hoy, pues sería formas de cómo, de esa forma, en esa forma circular también que hemos venido hablando, podemos garantizar no solamente que las soluciones van a ser estimuladas por la cooperación, sino que las soluciones y su permanencia van a depender de nuestras propias acciones en lo nacional. Yo creo que eso más o menos resume un poquito lo que se conversó. Muchas gracias, embajadora.
Bueno, gracias Max, y en respuesta, antes de pasar a las por lo menos 2 preguntas, podemos pensar que tenemos el tiempo para hacerlo, nos estamos estirando un poquito más, ya falta poco para el final, pero en respuesta hacia dónde vamos, a mí me gustaría pasarles un pequeño aviso, porque como ustedes saben, el 31 de noviembre y el 1 de diciembre, la Argentina tiene el honor de encabezar el G20, y entonces en el marco de la presidencia del G20 me gustaría decirles que Argentina organizó 2 reuniones del grupo de trabajo sobre sustentabilidad climática, cuyos 3 ejes principales fueron, en primer lugar, el alineamiento de la financiación internacional sobre flujos de cambio climático para la efectiva implementación de las contribuciones nacionales determinadas para el cambio climático. En segundo lugar, adaptación al cambio climático y eventos de clima extremo, con foco en el desarrollo de la resiliencia, en infraestructura y en la creación de empleo. Y por último, desarrollo de estrategias de largo plazo para bajar emisiones de efecto invernadero, con foco en enfoques y metodología para su diseño y en buenas prácticas. El resultado de estas reuniones fue exitoso. Tuvimos 2 consensos de los 3 documentos en que se buscó aprobar, y ello permitió iniciar un constructivo diálogo sobre un posible párrafo en materia de clima para la declaración de líderes, involucrando a todos los países del G20 en dicha tarea. Así que gracias a mi querida amiga Jennifer Lotten por haber organizado de esta manera este evento, por dejarnos pasar este anuncio. Y entonces ahora sí, vamos a dar paso a 2 preguntas. A ver, adelante.
Gracias, embajadora. Mi nombre es Carlos Rodríguez de Uruguay. Ante todo, quisiera agradecerle a Canadá, por habernos traído este excelente evento. Y creo que de lo cual surgen algunos hechos que son incontrastables. El cambio climático existe, todos estamos trabajando hacia él, nos va a afectar a todos, pero según el IPCC no nos alcanza. O sea que en algo estamos fallando. Es decir, llámese la academia, llámese los gobiernos, pero como vulgarmente decimos en Uruguay, es decir, la liebre nos sigue sacando ventaja. Entonces, me pregunto, ¿quién es el que poluciona en el medio ambiente? Nosotros como individuos somos una parte. Los gobiernos no son, salvo en aquellos donde el Estado tenga un gran peso en la actividad industrial, por ejemplo. O sea que, ¿qué nos va quedando? Nos va quedando el sector privado. O nosotros mismos. El sector privado, el CEO de una empresa, ¿por qué va a reducir un 30% su índice de utilidades en manos de una política de responsabilidad social empresarial que le puede costar el puesto? O a nivel individual, ¿por qué voy a cambiar mi auto, es decir, por un auto eléctrico que me sale $20.000 más caro, si no me lo financian o si no me le bajan el precio por reducción de impuestos? Entonces, ¿a dónde quiero apuntar? A que, independientemente de todo lo que escuchamos hoy, nos van quedando un aspecto y es, en el terreno, cómo bajar esos índices de polución. Y creo que ahí tenemos dos temas que quizás pudieran dar para que la embajadora Lotten, antes de que se vaya Mateo, nos pueda organizar una segunda ronda. Digo, lo de Mateo es para asegurar que salga bien. Es decir, una segunda ronda para ver en qué estamos fallando en eso. Creo que al sector privado tendríamos que hablar de incentivos. Es decir, ¿por qué Uruguay logró cambiar su matriz eléctrica? Muy simple, por el mecanismo de desarrollo limpio. En su momento, los bonos de carbono le permitieron a los proyectos de energía del sector privado acceder a un 5, un 6% más de utilidad, que de repente era toda la utilidad del proyecto. Pero creo que si no atacamos ese aspecto de incentivos al sector privado o de sensibilización hacia la sociedad civil en general, es decir, vamos a seguir teniendo el mismo problema, porque los gobiernos ni los organismos multilaterales no plantamos soja ni criamos vacas. Gracias.
Bueno, entiendo que este ha sido un consejo más que una pregunta, así que vamos a tomarlo como tal y a seguir con un pedido, y a seguir con otra pregunta.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Buenas tardes. Mi nombre es César Murillo, de la representación de la Secretaría de Medio Ambiente y Recursos Naturales en México, en la Embajada de México. Y primero quería felicitar y agradecer al Gobierno de Canadá por haber motivado y generado este diálogo. Ha sido realmente muy importante para todos nosotros. Segundo, agradecer a la OEA que haya permitido que este foro realmente nos permita identificarnos me parece, con una similitud muy clara de riesgos que padecemos todos al enfrentar el tema de cambio climático. Y creo que la frase o la palabra que decían de que se les pone rostro a la adaptabilidad, a la mitigación, que somos personas concretas que padecemos cuando hay una incidencia de esta naturaleza, pues nos permite quizás tener una mayor sensibilización. Y simplemente me estaría enfocando a la pregunta, si fuera posible, como comentaba el director Springer, si se podía generar una hoja de ruta enfocado a ese fortalecimiento de diálogo e intercambio de información entre las naciones, obviamente aquí hemisféricas, para lograr esa seguridad hemisférica climática, obviamente sin duplicar los esfuerzos internacionales que ya hay, pero creo que ese manejo, ese teje de comunicación entre las naciones que nos permita fluir en caso de intercambio de expertos, a lo mejor tener ese grupo de expertos que sea nuestra primera fuerza de reacción entre catástrofes climáticas, que pudieran atender no a un país, sino a una región, que sepamos a quién le podamos preguntar, solo ver si fuera posible, y a lo mejor qué es lo que se tendría en un momento dado que hacer. Definitivamente la OEA tiene un rol insustituible para nuestros países, y la vocación que tiene la OEA precisamente es lograr que nuestros ciudadanos, nosotros mismos, tengamos una mayor seguridad como seres humanos y como continente. Muchas gracias.
¿Alguno de nuestros panelistas quiere agregar algo? Decir. ¿No? A ver, sí, la senadora.
I actually wanted to contribute or respond to the first contribution insofar as how do you get the corporate sector to come in line and recognize that their corporate responsibility extends further. For us in Antigua and Barbuda, I believe he who feels it knows it. And until it happens to you personally, you really don't get the full impact of it. So as a result of our experiences in the past, we have had to modify the way that we live. We have had to modify the way that we do business. And with the legislative support, for instance, was it last year that we went completely styrofoam free? It's legislated, no styrofoam containers or cups, and no plastic bags are allowed in the country. You cannot import it. There was a period of time for transition, and now there are penalties in place. And if you don't experience it, I think that is the fundamental. If you don't experience it, you really don't appreciate as much the urgency of making the changes. So that's why the forum like these are very important, that you're able to hear from us, our personal experiences, how we live on a day. I mean, last month we were in Canada, and while I was making a presentation on climate change, there was a hurricane passing through the region. So at the end of it, on the very day, I wasn't even sure if I would have a home to go home to. So unless you experience it personally, the impetus to make the changes are not as urgent. But as I said, we share the experiences, and the legislative framework is important. Sometimes you have to compel people to do what is necessary. So if you have the penalties in place, corporate responsibility will, the overriding objective of profitability will take a back stage, and your corporate responsibility will have to come forward. Thank you.
Filippo?
Sí, muchas gracias. But I wanted to perhaps leave the question on the hoja de ruta to the colleagues at the OEA, but maybe going back again to the point made by the director for Uruguay, or the gentleman for Uruguay. In terms of where is the incentive, well, I think, I mean, especially looking at the private sector, there are already a number of like enlightened CEO that are seeing how you can actually decouple your economic growth from your externalities. I mean, I don't think that growth in terms of revenues and taking a more sustainable path, they necessarily have to be seen as two incompatible and separate things. So the companies, I'm not going to name names, but there are good examples out there of both responsible and profitable multinationals in a number of sectors. In terms of the role of the government, and you mentioned the clean development mechanism, that was something I was involved about 15 years ago at the start of my career with, and it was a very successful example, but it's sort of like, the role of the government, as I see it now, is that of opening the space for private sector action. How do you do that? Well, you think of policies, incentives, and I think Uruguay has a really good regulatory framework for feed-in tariff for large wind power. So it is a really good example of how you can incentivize. Well, leaving aside the CDM for a second, you can keep incentivizing even in the absence of a carbon pricing or an effective carbon pricing, incentivizing private sector and sort of power producers. And lastly, perhaps sort of mentioning something that the colleagues at the World Bank are doing. They are trying to, there's something called cascade approach that the president of the World Bank has been working on over the last couple of years, which basically sort of tries to allocate in the most effective and efficient way the scarce public resources for climate change. So the first question that one should be asking is there anything that could be done at the regulatory side? So without using scarce public finance. And if the question is no, then the next question would be, is there anything that could be done to structure risk mitigation instruments without using public finance? And then only if any or none of those options are available, then we can record to public debt, which is generally the most expensive of all the different uses for climate funding. So that's just like to give a little bit more of optimism in terms of like the public sector has an important role to play when it comes to opening the space for the private sector.
Bueno, muy bien, agradecemos a los panelistas y sin duda mucho por hacer en el futuro. Le doy la palabra entonces a Jennifer.
Thanks very much, Ambassador Bertol, and thank you to all the panelists. I'd like to thank everyone who took part today and who spoke in a panel, who moderated, the Ambassador of St. Lucia, Ambassador of Argentina, Also, we had the ambassador of Ecuador participate. So many people took part in making today's event a success today. I'd like in particular to thank Augusti Bordas and his team, Bianca Martinez and Christian Aruto. I'd also like to thank Cletus Springer and the support from the Secretariat. Please, ladies and gentlemen, join me in thanking the interpreters who have worked so hard today and have made this event so successful. I'd also like to thank Parlaméricas, who brought the senator to participate with us today and for their constant partnership in taking forward important events and continuing to highlight the role of legislators in these efforts. I'd also like to thank Matteo Barney within the permanent mission of the OAS for so much. He put in a tremendous amount of work and he deserves a round of applause. All of you as well who sat through the day, I think what we're left with now is a tremendous amount of information. I'm very impressed and I'm a little bit dazzled, and I'm sitting back and thinking and taking on board the comment we heard a moment or two ago about a follow-up event. Don't worry, Matteo, I'm not going to make any commitments here. But I am going to say what we need to do now is perhaps think a bit. Take this all in. Give ourselves a little bit of time to digest. We've heard about a tremendous amount of activity, a tremendous amount of commitment. We've seen evidence-based information before us, we've seen initiatives, and we've heard from individuals with creative ideas. The next question, as far as I'm concerned, and given where we are right now, is what does the OAS do with this? And what do the member states of the OAS do together to make the kinds of decisions and start things in motion that will address an appropriate role for this organization? And most importantly, how do we reach out and create the partnerships that we've been hearing about all day long? That, I think, for me, was the biggest message. How do we create the right kinds of partnerships? How do we begin to think about a role for the OAS? It is a convening forum. It is a place for policy discussion, and I'd like to see us explore some of those ideas. Now, it's been a long day, but the best is yet to come. We have Executive Secretary of SETI, Kim Osborne, for some closing comments, and thank you so much for being with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, Kim Osborne.
Thank you, Ambassador, and I second the motion. I actually had it in my notes for a follow-up event, so I think we're all thinking along the same lines. Thank you, Carlos. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for staying with us throughout the day. I am very grateful for the leadership of Environment and Climate Change Canada and the permanent mission of Canada to the OAS for having collaborated with the Department of Sustainable Development of the Secretariat for Integral Development in convening this important regional workshop. Today we saw the true convening power of the OAS. This is something that we've often spoken about as a comparative strength of the OAS, but I believe that is something we very often take for granted. Importantly for me was the fact that we did not restrict ourselves to mere dialogue, but we pushed ourselves to identify concrete actions, including those that the OAS can help advance through existing mandates and programs. From the perspective of the Secretariat for Integral Development and its various mandates, including in areas such as sustainable development, small and medium and micro enterprises development, and technical cooperation, this event is an excellent and powerful example of what is possible when a member state seizes the value of the OAS as a medium for amplifying its own concerns and actions to improve the lives of the people of the hemisphere. Today's event is an example of cooperation in climate action. The presentations throughout today emphasized the reality of climate change. They gave us a clear sense of the depth and breadth of the challenge of climate change poses to the development prospects of the Americas and the world. Importantly, they have left us with a sense of hope that the threat of climate change is being taken seriously, and some concrete things are being done and are planned to contain global warming and to build resilience to climate change. We had ample examples of initiatives being undertaken in Canada, Mexico, Guyana, among other places, to build coastal resilience. We also heard about the more global and equally promising initiatives, such as the Oceans Unite initiatives that President Figueres highlighted in his presentation. I believe that events such as these are crucial in helping to build awareness about the impacts of climate change, as well as these events help to boost advocacy on the need for strong, coordinated, and sustained climate action. Colleagues, this is the time for climate action, and the dialogue that we must now have must be on determining what action must be taken to ensure that climate change is arrested and that vulnerable communities can build their resilience to its impacts. Among the numerous actions highlighted today, I will only attempt to focus on a few, as the report emanating from this session will be shared, and then we can focus on which ones we are best positioned to collaborate on with Canada and the rest of the OAS membership and the wider inter-American community. And as I said before, I think we should have a follow-up to this. This would be SETI's organization, not yours, Mateo, to make sure that we are moving forward, that we're not just having discussions, but we're turning our discussions into concrete action. We learned that the roots of vulnerability to climate change must be addressed through sustained investment policy advancement and strategy implementation, which must be done through the resilience lens. We learned that multi-stakeholder cooperation is needed to reduce the rate of climate change and to build the capacity of vulnerable groups and the need to attend to the specific needs of women and children. We learned that community climate risk awareness programs are needed to help communities to better understand the risk involved in living in vulnerable areas. That climate change will increase conflicts over land use and access to land, and so increased investment in conflict resolution and land management is urgently needed. We also recognize the importance of regional organizations like the OAS and the role that they can play in facilitating the design and implementation of a climate research agenda involving universities in the Americas. That climate change will negatively impact food security, and women are more likely to suffer. The links between food security, health security will have to be strengthened. We learned that access to finance remains a key challenge for countries of the region, particularly small island developing states, in their quest towards building resilience and becoming climate smart. And so access to finance will need to be something that we address most urgently. We heard of the need to work with the private sector, particularly in the area of mitigation, where the private sector see opportunities for increasing their bottom line. This is by no means an exhaustive list of what was proposed or discussed today. We will have the opportunity for more in-depth discussion and analysis. However, as I listened to the presentation, I kept trying to connect the information shared and the recommendations made with our work within the Secretariat for Integral Development. In SETI, perhaps more than any other area of the OAS, of the General Secretariat, we have a strong sense that the OAS is much more than just a collection of member states. It is also a collection of the will, the energy, and the considerable capacity that member states possess to share their experiences and good practices. We know firsthand that in our universities we have the potential, with the help of Canada and others, to craft a climate change research agenda. As I speak, several universities in our region are engaged in such research. SETI already has a network of universities with direct links to rectors that can be leveraged to advance this agenda. SETI, through the Department of Sustainable Development, has an extensive repository of action research on climate change and climate variability in the context of the river basin management. Through much of this work, SETI has established a vast network of interlocutors at the national, sub-regional, and community levels in our countries. Strategic plans to combat climate change have been designed for nearly 20 transboundary river basins, and all of these plans define their roles for vulnerable groups such as women and children. Beyond the design of this plan, the OAS created regional institutions such as the TRIP 5Cs in Belize, ACTO in Brazil, and the SIC in Argentina. Regular encounters among these entities would be a useful way to build on the knowledge that already exists, as well as build consensus on new opportunities for cooperative climate action. I see SMEs as an excellent medium for advancing the economic resilience of vulnerable countries and for carrying forward the recommendations made regarding a gender-sensitive approach to combating climate change. economic resilience is often lost in the discussion on climate adaptation and mitigation. However, it is critical that vulnerable countries be given the means to build robust economies that can finance their own climate resilience efforts. We were told today that there is a $22 trillion worth of economic opportunities embedded in climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. I would propose that SETI is an ideal vehicle for engaging SMEs in the dialogue and action on how to tap into this vast economic opportunity that climate change presents. President Figueres expressed the need that was seconded by many others for the hemisphere to know that what the OAS does, its convening power and its capacity as the only regional organization that can bring all nations from the Arctic and to the Antarctic. The call for cooperation between and among member states in supporting each other as we attempt to become more climate smart. This is particularly important for the Caribbean region, where the threat of climate change is so very real and so very urgent. Against this background, the recommendations emanating from the second specialized CD meeting of high-level cooperation authorities held on September 20th and 21st, 2018, gave some clear ideas regarding some of the actions we can take to assist our member states to build resilience to disasters, including the slow onset disaster like climate change. The theme of the meeting was strengthening capacity for development cooperation and partnerships and for building resilience to disasters. We recognize within the context of that meeting and the call for action that the resilience building agenda is too big to be effectively addressed by any one stakeholder acting alone, but by coming together, the mere coming together of stakeholders, whether at the national, subnational, and regional global level, is not enough. And so that we have listed a number of areas in terms of building resilience, cooperation, and partnerships for resilience that we will be acting on, and we think that there's an avenue and opportunities for us to work together as member states moving forward. In order to provide countries with integrated and comprehensive support, effective, focused, and sustained coordination among stakeholders is paramount. Within the Secretariat of Integral Development, the framework for this coordinated partnership already exists. In fact, the core business of SETI is essentially the business of technical cooperation, and in that sense, through its work, SETI seeks to optimize partnerships, build alliances and networks, leverage development assistance, and provide more targeted technical cooperation support to our member states. Whether we do that through the Development Cooperation Fund, whether we do that through direct technical assistance, whether we do that through the programs and projects that we implement, that is how, whether we do that through the networks for exchanging experiences and good practices, we're well positioned to continue working and to expanding the reach of our member states in sharing the experiences, that the lessons learned, the opportunities that they have to share with others. So we are happy to position ourselves, to continue to position ourselves to do that, to work with Canada in that regard, in sharing that knowledge and experience between and among member states. From this, it is clear that with the right support, SETI can apply a multidimensional and integrated approach to climate action that encompasses its economic, social, environmental, scientific, and technological aspects. In closing, I wish to again express my appreciation to Ambassador, to Mateo, who's always in SETI, who's the extended staff member of SETI. We're very pleased that you to collaborate with Canada on this particular initiative. We trust that this is merely the beginning of a long and productive partnership that will bring real and durable benefits to the OAS member states as they seek to build resilience to climate change. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you, everyone, very much. We will ensure that presentations are made available. I think we talked about a Dropbox, and we'll make sure that everyone gets access to the information. There was a lot of it. It was really valuable. Thank you to all of you who are here for a long day, and stay tuned.